Good morning. And I think this is a good opportunity because we did a lot. That how much does the buyer have to bring to closing problem? There's a lot. There's a lot going in to that problem. So I certainly appreciate you guys for class last Thursday. I know it wasn't the easiest class. I do hope that you have had an opportunity to go back and review and look at it again. And for the sake of sounding like a broken record, I promise you, when you look at it the second time, it looks better than the first time. When you look at it the third time, it looks better than the second time. Each time you look at it, it gets a little bit easier and a little bit better. But one thing I do want to do, because we've talked about prorating various things, and all we talked about on Thursday was prorating um, taxes, this year's taxes. So I want to run through just a couple more scenarios of proration, things that we can prorate at settlement. And I think this will also serve as a good review for prorating as well. So we talked about taxes. Another thing that can be prorated at, good morning, at settlement is HOA dues. So the problem's got to tell you if there are HOA dues. And if there are HOA dues, is it monthly? Is it annually, right? There is no typical HOA. So the problem will have to specify for you. And HOA dues are going to work the same as annual property taxes. So they either paid or unpaid as of the date of settlement. So we need to determine who owes who. The buyer owes the seller or the seller owes the buyer, depending on if they're paid or unpaid. And that may take you back to page 587 that gives you the breakdown of the prorations. Another thing that we may see in a problem for proration is rent. If we're prorating rent. So if the buyer's buying with an existing lease, with a tenant in place, and the buyer's going to buy honoring that existing tenant. And at some point during the month, the tenant switches from being the sellers to the buyers. And we got to make sure that the appropriate landlord at that time is getting the money that they should. So for our purposes, unless you're told otherwise, rent is due and payable on the first of the month and it's going to cover that month. So in other words, when your tenant paid you on May 1st, they were paying rent for the month of May. To have everybody so far. They'll pay rent on June 1st for the month of June, July 1st for the month of July, etc. So if the seller was the landlord on May 1st, and at some point in the month of May, the buyer is going to become the landlord. The property is going to switch gears and the property is going to become the buyers. We're going to call the buyer the landlord when that happens. At some point in the month of May, depending on when closing is, we need to divvy that rent between the seller and the buyer, between the old landlord and the new landlord. So for simplicity, let's go to closing a little later in the month. Let's say we go to closing on May 26th. The seller still owned the property the front part of the year, not the year, I'm sorry, the month. The buyer owns the property the latter part of the month. So what we're saying here with rent, the tenant paid the seller landlord rent on May 1st. The property is changing hands before June 1st rolls around. So when June 1st rolls around, the tenant will pay the new landlord. Yesterday they were the buyer, today they're the owner, the landlord. Because the tenant has paid the seller the entire month of May, the seller has received rent for the whole month of May. Does the seller own the property for the whole month of May? No, they let it change hands at some point. So at settlement, the seller's got to pay the buyer. The seller owes the buyer a portion of the rent. Remember, the seller is going to be responsible for the day of closing. And what I mean by responsible is they're going to either pay that money if we were talking about taxes, or they're going to keep that money because we're talking about rent. So we're going to have, this is going to shake out as a debit the buyer, credit the seller. And it's going to be that the buyer owes the seller for their portion, and we're going to say a 30-day month, for their portion of the rent. Whenever that property changes hands, debit the buyer, credit the seller. No. We just said, sorry about that, you guys. The seller owes the buyer. Sorry about that. So we're going to do that from the day after to the end of the month. How many days? Remember how we count on the timeline when we're moving forward? Does anybody remember? Yeah, whip your fingers out. So we got the 27th, the 28th, the 29th, and the 30th. So we would have 4 days that the seller owes the buyer. 27, 28, 29, 30. Yeah. Yep. Seller is responsible for the 26th, so they will keep rent that day. Today, the tenant is the seller's. Tomorrow, the tenant is the buyer's. I'm assuming pre-licensing world with a 30-day month, and every month has 30 days for a total of a 360-day year. I am. The problem will have to tell you. But I'm making it up on the fly. So questions on prorating rent. I don't know a scenario you're going to see where the buyer owes the seller. Always do what the problem tells you. Did y'all hear what I just said? Always do what the problem just tells you. But typically, unless we're told otherwise, rent's due and payable on the 1st. The seller is going to owe the buyer for the period of time that they own the property. Questions on prorating rent. Another thing that we may see prorated, and we're going to start seeing this more and more, is interest. When the buyer assumes the seller's loan, the buyer is assuming the seller's loan. What does it mean to assume it? It means that's right. They're taking it. The buyer is taking over the seller's loan. So the seller is making their mortgage payment on May 1st. What do we remember about interest? How is interest paid? Where's your rear end? Interest is in arrears. So when the seller made that mortgage payment on May 1st, they're paying April's interest. That's what we mean by interest is paid in arrears. The buyer, we're going to go to closing. When did we go to closing? Was it the 26th? So let's go to closing on the 26th again. The property changes hands. The buyer's assuming the seller's loan, which means when the buyer, now the owner, makes the mortgage payment on June 1st, what are they paying when they're making that payment on June 1st? They're paying May's interest. Did the buyer own the property the entire month of May? Is it fair to make them pay the entire month of May? So now we got to stop and ask ourselves, who owes whom? That's a good question for you guys in the chat. Who owes who? And you can abbreviate. I know what you speak of. Interim interest. Who owes whom when the buyer is paying interest on June 1st for the entire month of May? The payment on June 1st, the buyer's paying that interest. So who owes who or whom? I'm never sure. I do math, I don't do grammar. Who owes who? Whom just sounds cooler. I'll say that. Buyer's making that mortgage payment on June 1st. And they make that payment on June 1st. It's covering the entire month of May's interest. So what we're seeing is that the seller owes the buyer, and that's going to shake out in settlement statement verbiage as a credit the seller, debit the buyer. And what the seller owes the buyer for is the period of time that they own the property, including the day of settlement. The seller owes the buyer some interest because the buyer's paying this month that we go to closing, this month that we are sharing this payment. We have to figure out, and in this case, we're going to have a debit the seller, credit the buyer. And remember the other piece about the buyer assuming the seller's loan? Let's just pretend that the sales price is $100,000. This is our sales price. You have an outstanding loan of $60,000. So you're going to let the buyer not only buy your house, but assume your loan. They're going to take over that payment of $60,000 with the exact same terms that you have. It would be an assignment. So the only thing that changes in the assignment is the name of one of the parties. So the terms are going to stay the same. The interest rate, the terms will stay the same. So your loan amount is $60,000. As the seller, you got to be made whole, don't you? You're selling your house for $100,000. I give you my loan for 60. How much is the buyer going to have to bring to closing to make the seller whole? They're going to have to bring an additional $40,000. That's how we assume the loan. You take over the payment, and then you got to bring the difference. Where are they getting that $40,000? Maybe they're applying for a second loan. Maybe they got that money laying around. That's all part of this approval process. So remember we said the other day that the lender has to approve the buyer before they assume the loan. This does not just happen. The buyer's got to go through the lending approval process. They got to go through underwriting. They got to go through all that. And upon approval, part of that approval is going to be, can you get your hands on $40,000? I'll give you the loan for 60. Can you come up with 40? Does that make sense? And that's how we make the seller whole. What questions do I have? All right. A little refresher on prorating. That's weird. And with that being said, we are now ready to jump into some appraisal process. So we are in Unit 17. Most of Unit 17 is about the appraiser. We're going to throw the broker in. We're going to compare some things on the broker and the appraiser. But for the most part, for Unit 17, I want you guys to put on your appraiser's hat and think like an appraiser, because this is what we're doing. This is like a mini appraisal. Now, as with the other things in this class that we talked about, we're just scratching surface. We're just introducing you to it. If this unit is interesting to you, then you may want to consider at some point in your career looking into your appraisal's license. They have to take a class. They have to pass a test. They have to do an apprenticeship, right? It's a process to get your appraisal license. But this is just another avenue of real estate that you may, at some point in your career, want to consider. Again, with that being said, we're just introducing you to the idea of real property valuation, helping you get that basic knowledge. So with our appraiser's hat on, for the most part, I'll tell you when you can put your broker hat back on. But with our appraiser's hats on, we first have to spend some time talking about what that word value means. And specifically what that word value means through the eyes of the appraiser. The appraiser can use as many of 3 approaches to value as they can, as applicable, to help them arrive at their opinion of value. So we're going to talk about those 3 approaches and when they may have more weight on one approach than another. And then we do get to pick our calculators up a little bit in this unit. So we're going to not only look at those 3 approaches to value, but we're going to look at how we can calculate, how we can arrive at an opinion of value as an appraiser. So I think the first thing we need to do, kind of the common theme I've said so far, we need to define value. What the heck is value? It's on page 456 of your book. Value is defined as an estimate or opinion of value completed by a licensed appraiser of a specific property as of a specific date. There's a lot going on in this sentence, so let's break this down. An appraisal is an estimate or an opinion. Are you telling me that another appraiser could have a different opinion and a third appraiser could have an even different opinion? Yeah, it is one person's opinion. And it's their opinion of what they think the value is. They arrive at their opinion by looking at those three approaches to value, as many as they can. But it might be that other appraisers are looking at different properties. They might be looking at different comps. So it's just one person's opinion of value. We're going to spend some time talking about value, but right now, to introduce us to value, appraisers are the only ones that get to use the word value. I need you guys right now, unless you're an appraiser, I need you right now to take that word value out of your vocabulary. Only appraisers can look at sellers and buyers and say the value is X amount. Again, more on that in just a second. And I'll even tell you what words you can use, since I'm telling you can't use the word value. So it's completed by a licensed appraiser. As we said, you have to go to school, you have to pass a test. I've heard once, I don't know if it's true or not, but I've heard once that appraisers, I know they have to apprentice like a lot, like they have to follow a licensed appraiser around on so many appraisals. And I've heard once that it was like 200 appraisals that they have to shadow, they have to follow before they're able to go out on their own. So it's a bit of a process, but you got to be licensed to offer that opinion of value. The appraiser is as of a specific property. The appraiser is just determining their opinion of value for 123 Main Street. 125 Main Street is going to have a different value. 127 Main Street is going to have a different value. What all we're talking about, all we care about right now is 123 Main Street. What is the value of that property? And an appraisal is only as of a specific date. Comps change. We're going to talk about that. Comps come and go. How far back we can look at comps change. And that's what fluctuates the market, the value in the market. The amount that the appraiser gives us, their opinion of value, is only good for today because comps change, because the market changes. Now, with that being said, most lenders will let us use an appraisal for up to 6 months. But what we need to understand is it really only matters today. 3 months from now, the market's going to look different. 9 months from now, it's going to look totally different than what it did today. So these numbers we're looking at for the appraisal is only as of today. What is my opinion of value today? But lenders will let us use it for up to 6 months, just so we don't have to get an appraisal done every day during the contract to closing process. As you can imagine, appraisers are regulated, kind of like real estate agents. They got state laws, they got local laws. Their federal regulations, they have FIRREA, Financial Institutions Reform, Recovery, and Enforcement Act. This is all in your book on page 546, so you may just want to highlight it real quick instead of trying to jot all this down. FIRREA is what gave the appraisers the appraisal foundation. That all comes from the state level, or the federal level, excuse me. And then you have state regulations as well. Again, they got to be licensed. Again, it's awfully similar to real estate brokers. There's not a single appraiser that deserves their appraisal license. They got to work to get it. And once they get it, they got to work to keep it. Sounds similar, doesn't it? There's not a one of us on this call that deserves a real estate license, myself included. We got to work to get it. Once we get it, we got to work to earn it. So the appraisers are heavily regulated as well, making sure that they're best protecting the consumer and the public. Congress has stepped in and give us the Uniform Standards of Professional Practice. This is just the appraisers' ethical. It's kind of like National Association of Realtors gives us our code of ethics. This is their code of ethics. The appraiser works for the lender. The appraisal is the property of the lender. The lender requires it so they can determine their loan to value ratio. The appraisal is the lender's. They let the buyer pay for it. Isn't that nice? But the appraisal belongs to the lender. They are the ones that require that information so they can determine their loan to value ratio. So before we get more and more into this idea of value, the more deeper into this idea of the appraiser, take your appraiser's hat off for just a second and let's see through the eyes of the broker. The broker does help the consumer arrive at a number. But remember, I'm not allowed to use the word value. I'm not allowed to conduct an appraisal because I'm not licensed. So what do I do as a broker? I can offer a CMA or a BPO. Once upon a time ago, these had a difference. Historically speaking, they did something different. But today, we're pretty much using them interchangeably. So for our purposes, a CMA is a BPO, BPO is a CMA. I just got to introduce you to the different ways you may see it on your exam and your practice. Typically speaking, historically, and you may see this on some of your practice questions, the BPO was conducted for a fee. We're going to talk a little bit more about that. As mentioned earlier, I've already told you guys, you're not allowed to say the word value unless you're an appraiser. Does anybody have your appraisals license? Every once in a while I get one. No? Okay. None of us on this call are allowed to use the word value. So what can we say? We say probable sales price or probable lease price. So when you're at that listing appointment and that seller looks at you and says, how much do you think I can sell your home for? You can sell my home for. Be very, very careful how you respond. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, based on my CMA, I'm going to say your probable sales price is, and brokers, you and I can report as a range because we're not appraisers. Appraisers are going to give an exact number. You and I don't have that level of expertise. We don't have that level of knowledge. We can't be held to that standard. So appraisers say value and a number. Brokers, we say probable sales price and a range. We can also do CMAs, BPOs for property management as well. If you're going into property management, your unit is coming soon. We're going to talk about property managers. Same thing. When that owner or landlord looks at you and says, what can you lease my unit for? Your response is, based on my CMA, I think your probable lease price is, and then we're going to report in a range. Couple things about CMAs and BPOs, and we're going to bookmark this with CMAs and BPOs, which means at the end of this class, we're going to talk about these again, put our broker hat back on. So we'll see this again. You guys, my soon-to-be provisional brokers, you cannot conduct a BPO or CMA for a fee. Only full brokers can do one for a fee. Does that say you cannot do a BPO? No, you can do a BPO. You just can't do it for a fee. Does everybody see that? You can do one, but you can't charge. As mentioned, historically speaking, the BPO was done for a fee. It was done for an outside, impartial third party. Somebody that just wanted an opinion on probable sales price. Good morning. I'm a heck of a lot cheaper than an appraiser. So it might be that they hire me for my opinion on the probable sales price. And of course, they're going to pay me for my time. A couple examples of who that outside third party might be. I used to work for a real estate firm that had a relocation company. And that relocation company was up in Connecticut. And those people in the relocation company in Connecticut had no idea what Winston-Salem looked like. None. They had no idea how to put a price tag on anything. Does that make sense? So if they were curious, if one of their relocation clients, if they wanted to list, they wanted a BPO done so they could help that relocation client. And they may call you a non-provisional broker, a non-PB, and say, you're not going to get this listing. We already have a listing agent. We just want two opinions. We got an opinion from the listing agent, but we want an opinion from you. And since you're not getting this listing, we're going to charge you. Or we're going to pay you. That's what we mean by that outside third party. Does that make sense? I had a provisional broker once, and she was shadowing a seasoned agent. She was in post licensing, and she was shadowing a seasoned agent. And the seasoned agent got a call from a divorce attorney wanting to know if she could offer her opinion on the price of the property so he could help settle the divorce decree. That would be an outside third party, BPO. So again, historically speaking, BPOs were done for a fee. You guys, you can do a BPO, you can do a CMA, but you can't charge a fee for it. None of us. BP, full broker, broker in charge, none of us can charge for BPO or CMA when it's just part of our job. So when you're at that listing appointment, could you imagine a world where you're at the listing appointment and the seller looks at you and says, what do you think I can sell my house for? And you say, well, cash at me $200 and I'll tell you. We don't live in that world, y'all. So that's just part of our job. When the seller wants to know our opinion, when the buyer looks at you and says, I want to make an offer, how much should I offer? I can't charge them for that because that's just part of my general brokerage services. That's part of my job. Question comes in, do all properties for sale have to be appraised? When a lender's involved, an appraisal is required, period, end of story. If it's a cash buyer, it's optional. Cash buyers don't have to get appraisals. They can if they want to. And I'm telling you guys right now, as a broker, if your cash buyer starts throwing out that word value a lot to you, I would recommend in writing that they have an appraisal done. What do we document? Everything. I would tell them the importance of having an appraisal done. That'll help answer your questions on value, and I'd have all that in writing. And then what they did with that information is all on them. Questions so far? More, again, we're getting more in the CMA and BPO. All right, appraiser hat back on. Let's talk more about this word value. So a couple of things that the appraiser's looking for when they're trying to arrive at value. So some characteristics of value. And they always say in order to have value, you have to have dust. So what are we looking for with value? What are some characteristics? Remember, you guys, the appraiser is putting a price tag on a property. The buyer buying a home is a consumer. You and I are consumers. We're all out there spending money. We're all out there looking at price tags. Do you guys ever come across a price tag that you think, oh my gosh, that is more than I would ever pay for that pair of jeans, for example? And you put that pair of jeans back on the rack, don't you? You say it doesn't have the value to me. It doesn't have those characteristics. Much larger scale, but same concept. The consumer buying a pair of jeans is the consumer buying a house. Just tack on a couple extra zeros to it. So the appraiser is trying to make sure that they have these characteristics to help them arrive at value. Whatever it is we're putting a price tag on, there's got to be a demand for it. You got to have a pool of people out there that want to buy it. This is why sometimes in a buyer's market, when demand is so low, prices might start coming down because the demand isn't there. The value isn't there. Compare that to the crazy market, seller's market we're coming out of. The demand was, if I say super high, that's still an understatement. The demand was like ridiculously high. So what did that do to the value when that demand was stupid high? That value went up because we had such a need. We had such a demand. There's got to be a demand for the product that we're putting that price tag on. Utility, it's got to have the capability to meet somebody's needs. How does it meet your future needs? Again, if you ever bought a house, you walk in the front door as a buyer, And you look at the house going, how can I use this property to work with my family? Does this property work with my family dynamics? Does it have the utility to do what we need it to do? It's got to be able to satisfy the future owner's needs and desires. Scarcity. Land, there's only so much land to go around, isn't there? Land is scarce. What happens when we run out of land to build on? Now we start building up. What do you think's happening to our downtowns? There's only so much room on New York City you can put things, right? So how do you put more stuff? Build up. You got to create. There's only so much land to go around. There's a finite supply of land. This would explain why property along a body of water, for example, maybe the ocean or a lake, this might explain why it tends to have more value because it's more scarce. There's only so many homes we can get up and down the East Coast, right? That land is scarce. And then the last characteristics to help us arrive at value, how easily can you transfer ownership? Can we transfer with clear title? Are there going to be issues? Are there a bunch of encroachments we have to deal with, for example? The ease of transferring the property absolutely helps us. So again, to have value, you have to have dust. And dust can help us remember those characteristics of value. One of the biggest things that the appraiser looks at is the market value. The appraiser determines the market value. The appraiser determines the most probable price a property will bring in this market. This market's different than the market 2 years ago. And guess what? It's going to be different than the market a year and a half from now. So what's the probable price that the property will bring today in this market? And that's what the appraiser is trying to determine. That's what they're trying to find, is that market value. Note that word probable. Does that say guarantee? No. Just because the appraiser offers their opinion of market value still doesn't tell us that that's what a buyer is willing to pay for it. Ultimately, the buyer will drive the market. It's whatever you're sitting down willing to pull your checkbook out for. Do you ever go back to that store and find that same pair of jeans before and now it's on sale? Now it's in the back of the store and it's on sale. What does that tell you about how they priced the value of that jeans originally? You didn't buy it. Evidently, enough people didn't buy it that it wound up in the back bin. That's a probable price. Sometimes you got to put it out there. You're throwing spaghetti at the wall sometimes, aren't you? Sometimes you got to put it out there and see what sticks, see what the people are willing to pay for it. So if the appraiser is determining market value, let's do a couple side-by-side comparisons here. The buyer is the one actually driving the market because they're the one that's going to pay the market price. The market price is what the buyer is actually willing to pay for. So the market of value is the appraiser's opinion, the appraiser's opinion. The market price is what a buyer was actually willing to pay for it. The appraiser's job is to get the market value as close to market price in a fair market. I also think it's helpful to compare market value to market cost. Some consumers feel that once they put money into their investment, once they put money into their property, they're going to get 100% return. We don't get 100% return. Now, with that being said, a new roof has more value than a 30-year-old roof. However, once you put that new roof on, it starts losing value. The next rainstorm, the next hail. Have you guys ever heard the saying that once you drive a brand new car off the lot, once that brand new car hits the street, it starts losing value? Same thing here. You put a brand new roof on it. Yes, it has more value than a 30-year-old roof. but you're not going to be able to get 100% return. And I think no, I know sometimes homeowners, you'll go to this listing appointment and they'll hand you a piece of paper. This is how much I paid for the HVAC 4 years ago. This is how much I paid for the new roof 2 years ago. This is how much I paid for the water heater 6 months ago. Well, that's awesome. And that helps. Thank you for sharing that with me. But you're not going to get 100% return. And that's that past expenditures. That's that. Thank you. There's also some forces that influence value, forces that drive value. Social forces would include our trends, our social trends, our trends in marriage, our trends in divorce. Rates are changing. We're living a lot longer than we ever have before. We got to take that in consideration. We need a roof over our head. Family dynamics. We have adult kids moving back home with mom and dad. Heck, we have mom and dad moving in with adult kids. You have several different family dynamics going on under the same roof. That's all those social forces that are influencing value. Economic forces could be our local government. Think of tax incentives to bring businesses in, for example, trying to lure in some of those Amazon warehouses. How does that affect value? Once you bring in some of those outside forces, once we have some growth, then we can start seeing higher employment levels. Property taxation is an economic force that could influence value. Some counties are known for paying more for taxes than others. Anybody in this call live in Guilford County? Guilford County is known for higher taxes than their neighboring counties. It's just the reputation they got somewhere along the line. So you got to take that into consideration if you're thinking about buying in Guilford County, or the appraiser puts value on that. Political forces, again, your local government, zoning, building codes, tax structures. How does that affect value? I'll be really honest with you guys. We got an election year. That's about as political as I get in this class. So we got an election year this year. We're going to notice a slight pause in real estate because a lot of people, and I've seen this, how many election years have I been through in my years? I've seen this. We have a slight pause because a lot of people are waiting to see what the outcome of this election is. And if the parties change side, those that have been holding on to their money for the last 4 years, if the parties change sides, they're going to come out of the woodwork ready to spend their money. Does this make sense? So these election years, and this could be local elections as well, if you have two different candidates, such as we tend to do with our presidential candidates. So we're gonna feel the effect of political forces later this year. Slight pause. You got to pay attention for it. And then some environmental conditions. So, what are the 3 most important things about real estate? Location, location, location. Where is this property located to the amenities? Where is it located to infrastructure, transportation, your job? All of those environmental conditions, physical forces. Again, this is all forces that influence, that affect value. The appraiser also comes with words that we need a basic understanding. I think if you guys get a test question on this, you're going to have a scenario, and then you'll have these as your 4 answer choices. By the way, on page 459, and we start talking about these different things, they updated your book last year, and one update I noticed is they gave you guys some examples. So there's some examples of social forces, economic forces, etc. So looking at these economic principles of value, anybody remember in Unit 1? How long ago was that? And we talked about highest and best use. We said we're going to see this again, and here we are. The appraiser is always going to consider highest and best use. Did y'all just hear my absolute word there? The appraiser is always going to consider highest and best use. Of all these words, I'd say highest and best use is the most important. Highest and best use tells the appraiser what's the most profitable use for this property. They're not looking at zoning. They're not looking at what you want to do with it. They're looking at what is the most profitable use of this property right now. That is going to affect, if the property is not being utilized for its highest and best use, then that's going to affect the value. Understand highest and best use can and does change over time. As our world changes, highest and best use can and will change over time. But there can only be one highest and best use at a time. And the appraiser's job is to determine what that is and determine if the property is utilizing their highest and best use. The theory of substitution says that when consumers of anything, when consumers have two products that are similar, we're comparing two products. You guys ever go comparison shopping? Maybe you got two things in your Amazon cart. Now you're down to which one do I buy, right? You're comparison shopping. And if we have two things that are similar, consumers, the theory of substitution says that consumers will typically gravitate towards the one that is cheaper. Now, if there's features that are available that the cheaper one doesn't have that you want, then you can justify paying for the more expensive one. But we're talking about two almost similar products. The theory of substitution says consumers will buy the cheaper of the two. Supply and demand is something else we talked about back in Unit 1. Economic 101. When supply is high, demand is low. When demand is high, supply is low. Now, in real estate, we don't sit around talking about supply and demand. In real estate, we talk about a buyer's market and a seller's market. We are currently in a seller's market, not as strong as what we were, but we are still in a seller's market. So in real estate, when we say we're in a seller's market, what we're saying is demand is high, supply is low. That was our problem 2 years ago. I didn't have enough inventory to meet the demand. As that pendulum is like way up here in a seller's market. Now it's more like here in a seller's market. And we're starting to see that pendulum come back around. And when that pendulum swings back around to a buyer's market, now what we're saying is buyer's market, we're looking at high supply and low demand. That's the economic forces. That's the supply and demand of real estate, buyer's market versus seller's market. Conformity. The theory of conformity says that the maximum value of the property is realized when it matches its surrounding. If a property doesn't conform, I'm not saying it doesn't have value. The appraiser just may not be able to use other properties nearby to help them arrive at this price because that property doesn't conform. Remember, they got 3 approaches, so they can use another approach. They don't have to look at comps. Have you guys ever been out on a Sunday afternoon, a nice drive, quiet drive on a Sunday afternoon, radio up, windows down, and you're on these 2-lane roads in the middle of nowhere and you don't really know where you are? And you kind of go, you drive past a quaint brick ranch home, after another brick ranch home, after another brick ranch home. And then you round the corner and bam, there's like this monstrosity up on the hill that's like gated and a 3-car garage and 3 stories and it's got a pool. Yeah, that thing doesn't conform. It doesn't match its surrounding areas. I did not say it did not have value. I said it didn't conform. It didn't match its surrounding area. The appraiser just may have to work a little harder to put a value on that. Anticipation. Either the truth or the rumor of a benefit or detriment coming can affect the value. It doesn't even have to be true. Maybe it's just a rumor that they're going to widen the road out front. may or may not be true, but we just have the rumor, that anticipation, knowing that something's going to change. Maybe it's a good change, maybe it's a bad change. But the knowing that something's going to change, that anticipation can affect value. Do I have anybody on the call that lives in, where are my Kernersville people? Do I have any? Yep, couple K Vegas people. How long have they been talking about that daggum belt loop? That's the anticipation of that thing coming. Y'all, I arrived in the Triad in 2000. I got here in 2000. You know what they were talking about in 2000? They were talking about that daggum belt loop. The anticipation of that thing coming has affected the value in properties nearby. I am proud to say, if you haven't been to Kernersville in a while, we actually have sections of the belt loop that we're able to drive on now. So that's like super exciting. And construction is out there continuing it. But the anticipation of that thing coming long before the first piece of equipment ever showed up, the anticipation of that thing coming has affected values in that area. Contribution. How do add-ons, additions, any improvement contribute to the value? Just because you add an in-ground pool doesn't mean, well, we know you're not going to get 100% return, but I think in-ground pools, you could take buyers and put them in two categories. Some see the value in a pool, others do not. So the contribution by putting in an in-ground pool, that improvement could affect the value. I'm all about homeowners doing to their property whatever they want to while you own it. I'm all about it. It's yours. Do with it whatever you want. But just realize your contribution, the next owner may not see the value in what you did. Does that make sense? I tend to think, do you guys ever see ads and remarks that talk about custom built this and custom designed that? You know what I hear when I hear that? What I hear? Cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. And who was that custom built for? Was that custom built for the next buyer? Nah, it's custom built for you. So the question is, you do it. Go do it. It's your home. Custom build it. But understand that it may not contribute to the value for the next owner. They may not see the value in that. Competition. I tend to think of our commercial, maybe even our retail stores with competition. Go to your favorite retail store, or maybe your favorite. See, we don't have malls anymore. What are they called? Like the Thruway Shopping Center, the outdoor. It's not a mall, but it's a chain of stores connected. I lost that word. You guys are with me though, right? Power Center, perfect. Thank you. Strip mall, thank you. My Winston-Salem people, let's go to Thruway Shopping Center. If you're not in Winston, you can go to whatever your favorite shopping center is, strip mall. And let's say we're going to go to Thruway Shopping Center for lunch today. We're going to go to Moe's. What does Thruway Shopping Center want us to do after we're done eating at Moe's? They want us to walk along and spend more money, right? They want us to go to Rack Room Shoes. They want us to go to that cool little kitchen gadget store. They want us to go to the different stores in Thruway. And that's the idea of competition, especially for commercial and retail. If we can get you here, hopefully the idea of competition will keep you here. So if we can get you, you got to go to Dewey's too and get you a little cake squares before you go, right? The idea is if we can get you to Moe's for lunch, then the power of competition, maybe we can keep you here and have you spending more money. So they can use each other to help draw profits for each other. Change. Part of the appraiser's job is to study the past market, to help them predict future change. I've been telling you guys since we started, we're seeing this seller's market. We were here a couple years ago, and we knew this couldn't stay here forever. We wouldn't survive if it stayed here forever. So we knew we had to expect some change. And so now we're still in a seller's market. We're, here-ish, but we're still in a seller's market. You know what we can predict? Somewhere in the future, we're going to be back in a buyer's market. We can predict that change. When you really study the market, you can even better determine how fast it's going to change, how soon we're going to be. So studying the past can help the appraiser determine future values. And then this last one, plottage, I have to go off book for this one. This one's in the syllabus, but it's not in your book. So that's why the little asterisk is there. The combination or the merger of multiple lots into one single lot. That's what we're saying with plottage. So if you're a developer and you're buying 3 adjacent lots, they all 3 touch somehow, and you buy those 3 lots and you combine them, that's what we're looking at as plottage. And what the appraiser cares about with plottage is that by combining those 3 lots, by buying those 3 lots, generally that one combined lot will have a higher value than the 3 separate, because we've increased square footage, we've combined them. So plottage is just looking at that higher value through the combination of, or through the merging of different lots. Questions so far? All right, let's go take our first break. And when we come back, we're going to talk about the appraisal process, and we're getting into our 3 approaches to value. we're back. I'm going to take attendance. I'm sure if you're here, I can see you. Let's talk about the appraisal process. And just to kind of give us try your phone. Yeah. This might be you coming in. Technology is great when it works, right, y'all? When it doesn't, makes us say words we didn't know we knew. Right. So talking about this appraisal process on page 461, again, just to kind of give us an idea. There's two classes of data that the appraiser looks at. Specific data is specific to the property. So when they're out there studying 123 Main Street, they're studying what makes 123 Main Street 123 Main Street. What gives it its value? What is it that we're trying to put that price on? General data then is looking at the neighborhood, the surrounding areas, proximity to those amenities, the infrastructure, jobs, etc. So it's studying the neighborhood data and the surrounding area. Specific data is just specific to the property. And you guys may want to make a note. Pages 461 over to 462 just kind of gives you a step-by-step of the appraiser's process. So how they're going to handle this. Again, you know, this is Green Star, so I wouldn't spend all your study time on it. But you may just kind of want to look just to get an overall idea of the process that they use. We're getting more into specifics. So what I'd like you guys to do now is turn with me to page 464. And I forgot to tell you guys to bring your magnifying glass with you to class today, but you may need your magnifying glass or, you know, your readers. But what we're looking at on page 464 over to 466 is a sample appraisal. And we're going to come back and visit this because we got a lot in this appraisal that we haven't talked about yet. So we're going to come back and revisit this in just a second once we know more. But the one thing I do want to point you guys out now is while we're trying to see this, you guys see on the report, the far left-hand side, that black bar that runs down the left-hand side? You guys see that? And if you look really, really close, there's wording in that black bar. So on page 464, it starts with the subject property, and then you have the contract information, the neighborhood information, the site, the improvements, and etc. over on 465 and 66. Instead of straining your eyes trying to see that black bar, go back to page 463. What's in that black bar is spelled out for us on page 463. And it even tells us what those different categories are. So we don't have to try to look at the report. By the way, in the real world, that's what an appraisal report looks like. The good news is you can get it in PDF where you can blow it up a little bit and make it where you can see it. We just can't do that in our book. But yeah, what we just saw in that black bar, it's kind of spelled out for us on page 463. So we'll come back to this once we talk about starting on page 467. Once we talk about the specific approaches to value. As mentioned earlier, the appraiser, there's 3 approaches to value that the appraiser may use. Which approach they use or which approaches they use depends on the type of property. So as we go through each approach, we're going to talk about which property this approach is best for and how the appraiser can use it. I'll also say that of the 3 approaches, the appraiser is going to use as many of the 3 as they can. Ideally, they want to use at least two, and they'll always be able to use at least two. We'll talk about that. But they want to use as many of the three as they can. They're going to put the most weight on the approach that relates to that property. So each approach is better for a different type of property, knowing that they're going to use as many of these as they can to help them arrive at their opinion of value. So the first approach that the appraiser may use is called the sales comparison approach. This could also be known as the market data approach. Another one of those fun things that has a couple different meanings. The sales comparison approach, what we're going to do is we're going to study the subject property. The subject property is the one we're trying to put value on. And once we study that subject property, then the appraiser is going to go out and find recently sold nearby comps. Let's break that down. Recently sold, meaning we want things that close within the last 2 weeks, maybe a couple months. Ideally, with recently sold in a normal market, which doesn't exist that often, but in a normal market, we should be able to use recently sold comps that closed up to 6 months ago. The sooner they close, though, the better the comp. So we're out there looking for properties that a buyer has actually paid, recently sold, meaning somebody was willing to recently pay a price for this house. And because we know that somebody actually was willing to pay that price because it sold, that can help the appraiser study those comps. The theory behind the sales comparison approach is that by studying those recently sold comps, it's going to help us determine what a buyer would pay for this property, this subject property. They also need to be nearby. We'll see in just a second. You could put a value on a home in Winston-Salem, and then you could pick that home up and move it to Greensboro, and its value just changed. What changed on the home? Absolutely nothing. The only thing that changed is its location. So we want nearby. We don't want to go too far out. In a perfect world, in a normal market, we're looking at properties within this subdivision or within like a mile radius, for example. When we're doing sales comparison approaches, I always think of like just a Google search. We go to Google and we may start broad, and we may realize that's too big. We need to narrow it down, right? With the appraiser, we tend to start smaller, recently sold, nearby comps, and going out as needed. So if I don't have a recently sold comp within the last 3 months, then I may need to go out to 4 months. I may need to go out to 5 months. Does that make sense? If I don't have recently sold comps within a quarter mile radius, then maybe I need to go out to a half a mile radius or a mile radius. So we want to start small. That's how we get recently sold nearby. I mean, if the house next door recently sold, if the house next door closed next week, that's a great comp. Maybe is a great comp. There's other things to take into consideration. So the comps need to be as similar to the subject as we can. The fewer adjustments we have to make to the comps, the better. With that being said, there are no two properties that are exactly the same. Even in our cookie cutterest of neighborhoods, go to a townhome community where everything looks exactly the same from outside. Everything changes when you walk in the front door. So there are no two properties that are exactly the same. We're never going to find an exact match. Instead, what we're going to do is we're going to find these comps that are recently sold nearby as similar to the subject property as possible. And the key to the sales comparison approach is we're going to adjust the comps to meet the subject. Never, ever. I just threw y'all two absolute words right there. Never, ever adjust the subject. We adjust the comps to match the subject. We're going to adjust the comps to get as close to the subject as we can, because we're trying to determine, this appraiser is trying to determine value for the subject. So we mentioned earlier that each approach is better for a different property. The sales comparison approach is best for resale single family properties and land. When the appraiser is trying to arrive at value at resale properties and land, they're going to put the most weight on the sales comparison approach. This is the approach that is better to find those properties. Note that that says resale. The sales comparison approach is not best for new construction. We will talk about new construction in just a second. If you're trying to put a value on land, the appraiser would maybe be more apt to use the sales comparison approach. So the adjustments are made to the comps only. Never ever adjust the subject. So let's say what we have, we've gone out and we've studied the subject property. What do I mean by studying the subject property? I know how big the lot is. If you're looking at a property that has 1/4 of an acre versus one that has 5, don't we need to take into consideration land? We got to take everything into consideration. So we're going to look at the lot size. We're going to look at the size of the structure. One that has 800 square feet isn't the same as one that has 2,500 square feet. The year that it was built. We want properties that were built about the same time. Something that's built today is not the way it was built back in the 60s. The products, the standards, the codes, all that has changed. So we're trying to find, and maybe, again, it's one of those things we tend to start in smaller, I guess, and work our way out. So what else is a feature of this sales comparison approach? Is it has something that's different, that's unique, that we want to take into consideration. Maybe we find homes, all the comps that we're looking at has 3 bedrooms, for example. Maybe they all have the same number of bathrooms. We can look at any feature of the comps, but no matter what we're looking at, we got to get the comps that are closest to the subject. And that's going to help us determine what's a good comp and what's not as good of a comp. So let's pretend that this line per square foot, let's pretend that this line is our subject property. And I've gone out and I've studied, my caps lock is broke. So I'm not yelling at you guys. Sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. I spilled coffee on my laptop a year ago. I'm still dealing with this. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. So caps lock is on today, you guys. Sorry about that. If this line is our subject property and we've gone out and we studied the subject property, we know the year that it was built. We know how many bedrooms it has. It's got a fireplace. It's got a garage. We know how many square feet it has. We know everything about the subject property. Now we got to go out and find comps to match, similar comps. Some comps, comp 1, let's call it, some comps are going to be inferior, which means some comps are going to be more than the subject property. So how do I make this comp match my subject? I need to deduct. The appraiser will deduct the value of whatever it is that makes it inferior. They will deduct that value to make it match the subject. We may also find comps that have inferior. I think I said that backwards, didn't I? Comp 1 is inferior. Dang it, I did say it wrong. Sorry, you guys. Comp 1 is superior. Fix your notes. Comp 1 is superior because it has a higher feature. Sorry about that. It has a higher feature than the subject. So in order to adjust comp 1 to match the subject, we need to deduct the value of whatever it is that makes that different. Comp 2 is the one that's inferior, which means it doesn't have the product. It doesn't have what the subject has. So how do we make comp 2 match the subject? We got to add 2. I got another fun little hand trick for you guys. Another silly thing I got you doing at the state exam, but hey, if it works, right? When we're doing the sales comparison approach, push back and give your guys some room because I don't want you to punch your device. So give yourself some room. And I want you to take your left hand, make a fist, and hold it straight out in front of you. We're going to call your left hand your subject property. And we got to make our right hand, no matter what, we got to make our right hand match our left. We're never going to move our left hand because this is our subject property. So let's say our subject property has 3 bedrooms. The first comp you look at has 4 bedrooms. Which one's superior? Which one has more? The comp. That's what we mean by superior. It's got more than the subject. So take your right hand, make a fist, and hold it straight up over your head. Subject has 3 bedrooms, the comp has 4. How do I make my right hand match my left? I have to lower it. I have to deduct the cost of that bedroom. Now I'll talk about cost of the bedroom in just a second. But we got to make the comp, the superior, match the subject. And how do we make that match? We have to lower it. We have to deduct it. All right, shake out that right hand. Subject property still has 3 bedrooms. We have found another comp that has 2. The comp is now inferior. It doesn't have as many bedrooms as the subject. So take your right hand, make a fist, and hold it down by your side. How do I make my right hand match my left? I add. We've got to add to inferior and deduct from superior. Now let's talk about cost. I've said a lot about cost. We are not appraisers. We are not an appraisal school. It's not our job to determine the value of a bedroom. That's everything the appraisers get to do when they're in their school. For your exams, they've got to tell you the value of a bedroom. They've got to tell you the value of the things that they want you to adjust. Did everybody just hear me? This tends to cause panic if you didn't hear me the first time. They've got to tell you the value of, for example, the bedroom. If you want to learn how to calculate the value of a bedroom, once you get your real estate license, sign up for appraiser school. That's where you learn that. Fair enough? Everybody good? Let's alleviate that stress if we can. So we always adjust the comps to match the subject. Things that we look for, that the appraiser looks for to make these adjustments. What are things that we want to adjust? Well, we just said the date of the sale. We want things that closed, recently sold. So maybe they just closed last week. Maybe they sold 3 months ago. But we want things that are recently sold because that's the market that we're in. This is the current market. And that's what we want to make sure that we're studying. I guess what I'm telling you guys is the appraisers follow the market. As value goes up, eventually appraisers' market value is going to go up. If we start seeing prices come down, then eventually we're going to see the appraisers' market value come down because they're studying what buyers have recently been willing to pay for that property. We've talked about location. I want similar. I want close by. How close by? Well, a lot of that depends on density, population. It may depend on how many closings we've had in this subdivision in the last 6 months or whatever. If we haven't had a closing in the subdivision in the last 6 months, then we may need to go out to the neighboring subdivision. But again, we're going to start small and work our way out as needed. Physical features. The appraiser can use any physical feature of the subject property, whatever they determine has that value. So they may look at, like we said, the size of the lot, the size of the land, the size, the square footage of the property. Is it a 2-story? We want to, the comps want to be similar property types. So we want to compare a 2-story subject to a 2-story comp. It's not really fair to compare a condo to a 2-story brick house, is it? So we want to have similar condo to condo, townhome to townhome, 2-story to 2-story. And then terms and condition of sales. Again, depending on the market, appraisers may not use foreclosures. Thank you. Foreclosures, for example. Now, if it's a bad market, a housing market crash type market where every other home was a foreclosure, guess what? Appraisers had to start using foreclosures because it was the market. It was what was going on right now in the market. So terms and conditions, what's typical in this market right now? What's typical? What's going on in this market? Yes, we have foreclosures out there right now, but they're not the norm. So we're going to try to just stick to the norm. If that pendulum swings back and we start dealing with a lot of foreclosures, that's the norm. And so we can expect them to see those in appraisers. Question comes in, has there ever been an owner that's disagreed with the appraiser? Absolutely. There's also been buyers that disagree. Lenders have disagreed. So there's a process that we can go through, start with the lender, and there's a process we can go through. We can request another appraisal. They'd send somebody else if they warrant it, right? Like you got to have reasoning for your disagreement. But if they warrant it, then they may send another appraiser out to get their opinion. But just be careful because that second appraiser's opinion may still be less than the first one. That backfires sometimes too. But to the point, can you contest an appraisal? It depends. Start with the lender. Absolutely. So terms and conditions of the sale. So the sales comparison approach. We're selecting comps to match the subject. We're selecting comps that are as similar to the subject as possible. Again, the theory behind the sales comparison approach is if we study these recently sold comps and adjust the comps to match the subject, then theoretically, that's what a buyer would be willing to pay for the subject. We're arriving at the subject property by studying comps. So similar to the subject as possible. Don't try to pull comps. If you're getting a comp for a condo, don't pull a 2-story brick home. It doesn't work like that. We want as similar as we can. And this is where it gets tricky because there are no two properties that are exactly the same. Be very, very careful of your wording there. We want them that are recently sold. You know, we try to go back. The earlier sold, the better. But we try to go back. We try to stick within 4 to 6 months. Again, it depends on the market. If we haven't had a closing in this area in 6 months, we may need to go back a little bit further. The appraiser is going to assign dollar values to the difference. So the appraiser is going to determine this is the cost of a fireplace. This is what a garage is going for. These are the dollar values so they can make those adjustments to the differences. Again, we're not determining those values. Your problems will give you those values to the differences. And we'll see an example in just a second. And then the correlation. This is the appraiser just kind of studying the sales comparison approach. How do these comps relate? Some comps are going to be better than others. So maybe comp 1 is the most similar. So that's the one we put the most weight on. Maybe comp 3 is our worst one. We're not going to have as much weight. It's not a simple averaging, you guys. It's a correlation process. And they're going to put the most weight on the properties that are the most similar. Turn with me, if you will, page 469. And we can see a sales comparison approach. The subject property is 155 Potter Drive. And you can see the first thing the appraiser did is they studied the subject property. The location, the age, it's 6 years old, the landscaping's good. It's a brick ranch, 3 bedrooms, 1.5 baths, etc. They went through the subject property and found all the information that they could about the subject property. And then this appraiser went out and they found 5 comps. Now, maybe they found more than 5 comps. These are the 5 that they felt were the best. What makes a good comp? The fewer adjustments to the comp, the better the comp. If you got to adjust every single thing on the comp to make it match the subject, that may not be a good comp. So the fewer adjustments. Appraisers try to find a minimum of 3 comps. 3 is generally a good number because it gives us a nice comparison. So this appraiser was a little ambitious, and they found 5, comp A, B, C, D, and E. We got the sales price. We know that's what a buyer was willing to pay for it. Once these properties close, the sales price becomes public records. So we know darn well through our public records that the buyer is willing to pay $118,000 for comp A. Then we go through, once we spell out the terms of the comps, then we go through and compare comp A to the subject, comp B to the subject, comp C to the subject. Are we comparing comp to comp? No, we're comparing each comp as it relates to the subject. So if we study comp A, I can see that my subject property has the exterior condition is average. But look at comp A. The exterior condition is better. What do I do to make a comp match the subject? If my comp has superior features, it's better. What do I need to do to make it match? We have to deduct. So for comp A, we deducted the difference in the exterior condition. And although a buyer paid $118,000, now that I've adjusted comp A to match the subject property, comp A's adjusted value is $116,500. We adjusted the comp to match the subject. In other words, if I were to fix just this one thing in the comp, now I'm looking at what a buyer would be willing to pay for that subject. We mentioned earlier that the appraisal is only good for one day, for a specific day. It's the comps that adjust this. Comps A, B, C, and D, did they tell us when they closed? Maybe they'll do. I'll let you guys look at that. But if they tell us when they close, let's say comp A closed 5 months ago. If you wait a couple more weeks, it's going to age out. We're going to have comps that closed 2 weeks ago. So why is it only good for a day? Because the comps are constantly moving. The comps are constantly changing. So the appraiser's gone through with these 5, and then you can see underneath the sales comparison approach there's a note. It kind of explains the appraiser's finding. And at the end, the appraiser might conclude that the indicated market value of the subject is $116,500. The appraiser studied the comps. I can just do a quick glance and tell you A is the best comp because A is the most similar to the subject. We made fewer adjustments. So is that how they got to the 116.5? Probably, because it's the most similar, and that's how they're arriving at that number. Don't use averaging, simple averaging. They're using that correlation. So we're going to wear dual hats for a second. We got to compare, make sure we're good. The appraiser versus what we do as a broker. And what we do as a broker, the CMA, is the closest thing to the sales comparison approach. So the appraiser uses the sales comparison approach to derive a value, and they're going to give a specific number. The value of your property is $116,500. We're going to talk next about CMAs or BPOs. Remember, we're using those interchangeably. You and I don't get to say value. Never look at a homeowner or a buyer and say the value of the property is. You just got way out of your lane. Stay in your lane. My verbiage is probable sales price or probable lease price. And then we make sure that we report it as a range. Let's just pretend for 1 second that page 469 is a CMA and not a sales comparison approach. And if I were doing this CMA on 469, I would look at the homeowner and I would say, based on my CMA, your probable sales price is between $112,000 and $119,500. If I look at A, B, C, and D and E, everybody see that? I gave them the range instead of that specific number. So for the CMA, what gets me to the 112 or the 119.5? Now we got to look at the condition of the property. How does your home compare to others in this range? If you have the updated kitchen and updated bathrooms, we'll probably get you more than 119.5. If you haven't updated the kitchen since the 60s, you're probably closer to the range of 112. Does that make sense? That's where now we can study pictures. Now we can look at other features to determine what's the market. Shoot, 2 years ago, I would have said, let's put this thing on the market for 130,000, right? Because that's the market that we were in. It depends on the market. But this probable sales price that we're doing is going to help us. That's what we're looking for. What do we think a buyer would be willing to pay for the property? And then what are we going to list it for is a different question. This is just helping us determine probable sales price. Now that we have this, now based on all those other factors we just mentioned, we can determine what a good listing price is. You want to allow some wiggle room for negotiations. How much wiggle room for negotiations? It depends on the market. 2 years ago, there was not much negotiating going on. Today, we're starting to see negotiations come back. So we still need to price it right, knowing this is our probable sales price. So that CMA is an informal version. It's what we do. The informal version of the sales comparison approach is the CMA. Make sure we report as a range. Couple things we do different that the appraiser doesn't do with the sales comparison approach. The appraiser only looks at recently sold comps. Our CMAs are also, in addition to recently sold comps, we're also going to talk to the seller specifically when we're at that listing appointment about other current listings within this radius. Are we looking at a 1/4 mile radius? Or are we looking at the subdivision? We're going to refer to active listings. Why do I care about active listings when I'm talking to a seller? When I'm at my listing appointment, why do we care about current? All I know is what it's on the market for. I don't know what a buyer's willing to pay for it. It's active. Why do I care about active? You want to venture a guess? Why do we care about current listings? Yeah, it's our competition. Isn't it important to talk about what the guy across the street has his house for sale at? For the sellers, it comes down to time versus money. You want lots of money? I may need more time. You want to sell fast? I may not be able to get you as much money. But by studying the competition, that's going to help us know, does your seller need to sell fast? Then we need to get in under the competition. Does your seller want lots of money? Then we can go in over knowing that we have time. Does that make sense? So studying those current lets us know what we're up against. Also with our CMAs, by the way, they will list properties that are under contract, but we don't see the sales price until it closes. So we see the listing price when it's under contract, whatever it was listed for when it went under contract. As far as contract goes, that would be, we could use those in the current for our CMAs. Also with the seller at this listing appointment, we're going to look at expired listings. Why am I looking at expired listings? Things that never sold. They just went off the market. What's a really good chance? What's one good reason why it might be expired? Maybe it's listed for too high. Maybe the list price was too high and no buyer was willing to pay that price. I don't know. I wasn't there. I can't tell you for sure. But what I do know is at this price, they didn't close. They didn't sell it. Why? I don't know. But what I do know is at this price, they were unable to sell it. And that's important because, guys, sellers come into this transaction with more value. You guys have heard the expression, value's in the eye of the beholder. The sellers come into this with the most value because to the seller, this is their home. To everybody else in the world, it's just a house. So the sellers have more value. And sometimes sellers kind have a hard time of seeing value through the eyes of the buyers. So you run this CMA and you give them a probable sales price. Let's see, what did we just say? I just gave you a probable sales price of 112 to 119.5. So you look at the seller and you say, based on my CMA, based on this information, I think your probable sales price is 112,000 to 119.5. Your home's in good condition. It's got all the updates. You're good to go. I say we put it on the market. I don't know. Let's put it on for 125. I'm just making numbers up here. Let's put it on for 125. We're at the top end of the range. It looks good. Let's put it on for 125. Your seller's going to look at you and say, that's nice. Can't we list it for 150,000? Okay, let's talk about that. Can I list it for 150? Sure. Do I believe it's going to sell for 150 based on my CMA? This is the seller's value coming in. This is this through the eyes of the sellers coming in. And it might be that if you have something or things that have expired at 150, now we can show the seller, look, your neighbors tried to sell for 150 and they didn't. They expired. So if we have expired within our range, we can use those just to help us better determine a price. Bottom line, you guys, like we've been saying, if you have a seller comes to a price and you come to a price, if you don't believe in your heart of hearts that you can sell this thing for 150,000, you have a decision to make. You may want to go talk to your BIC. Sometimes two heads are better than one, but you have a decision to make. Do you want to take this listing that you don't believe you can sell? And I can't answer that for you. But this is one thing I do know about life. I don't know a lot about life, but this is one thing I know. Numbers don't lie. And I'm handing you a CMA. We got a piece of paper in between us that's showing you what buyers are willing to pay for your property in this area. Does that make sense? Can we try for 150? That's up to you. But what I know is I got a CMA saying 112 to 119.5. Does that make sense? We're using this to help us arrive at that listing price. But remember, you guys, you may not take the listing, but remember old car. If you take it, once you're in, you're in. Once you're in that agency agreement, it's old car all the way. So you got a decision to make before you get into that agency agreement. CMA should be kept current as we're getting back into less and less of a seller's market, more into a buyer's market. You know, you might have a point in your listing, maybe you've had it on the market for 2 or 3 months and we haven't had much activity. We've only had about a showing or two. Nobody's gotten excited. Nobody's shown much interest. So after 3 months of being on the market, we may need to revisit the listing price with the seller. And at that case, whenever we are revisiting price, we need to do a current CMA. Because the CMA I did 3 months ago for when to list it is going to look different than we're doing now to talk about a price improvement, I think is what they're calling it now, a price improvement. It's a price drop. A price improvement. So we're going to keep that current, especially with the sellers. Whenever we talk about numbers, whenever we talk about money, we're going to pull a new CMA. Y'all think you're going to document every single CMA you pull for that seller? You're going to document it? Why don't I see more head shaking? Yes. What do we document? Everything. So y'all going to document the CMAs you pull for your sellers? You're going to keep those for your records for 3 years? Yeah. Some of us even are having sellers sign off on the CMAs now, having buyers sign off on the CMAs. So they can't say, I didn't see that. So we're going to make sure we're documenting, not just doing. Keep a copy for yourself. And then the other thing about the CMA, this is a client level service. If you want interpretation of the market data, you got to hire me. Only clients get this level of service. Customers, I can hand a customer a piece of paper with market data and say, here you go. Customers don't get interpretation. Customers don't get the benefit of me sitting down and explaining what this means. There's a big difference right there in first class and coach, isn't it? I give everybody the numbers. Here you go. It's only the client that gets the interpretation. It's only the client that gets the breakdown of those different levels of those CMAs. So with the CMA, their broker hat on, the Real Estate Commission, of course, is going to find us accountable for not performing these things in a competent manner. You guys will do these CMAs through MLS. And there's a handy dandy feature in MLS that you can click, make it happen, and it'll beep, boop, boop, and it'll generate a CMA for you. I learned very early in my sales career that I could pretty much make this CMA say whatever I want it to. It's really easy to manipulate this thing and make it say whatever I want. Is that performing it competently? No, no. We want to perform these things competently. You guys will get plenty of training on doing CMAs once you get out. The local board of realtors, I know, for example, Winston-Salem Board of Realtors, they offer a CMA class about every 3 or 4 months. I don't say it's once a quarter, but they offer it a couple times a year. The last time I went, they had an actual appraiser doing the class. That was very interesting. Your BIC will make sure that you're doing these CMAs. Sometimes you may do a CMA and want a second opinion. No matter how long you've been in the industry, it's always okay to ask for help. You have 30-year-olds or 30-year seasoned agents, veterans that have been doing this, and every once in a while they still come across a property that they want to have a second set of eyes on. When in doubt, find out. When in doubt, go to one of your peers or your BIC and say, hey, will you look at these numbers with me? Because this might be down to you deciding whether or not to take this listing or not. So utilize all your resources before you make that decision. And make sure you get the training so that you can perform these things in a competent manner. Clickety click is not how we best protect the public. Questions so far about our CMA? Right, appraiser's hat back on. Let's talk about sales comparison approach. One way the appraisers might use, for example, to arrive at a cost of a bedroom, we'll use as an example. The appraiser, don't write this down. The appraiser may look at, if they want to arrive at the cost of bedroom, they may study the comps and they may compare the comps. So the appraiser may say, well, if I want to find the value of a bedroom, what's a bedroom going for in this neighborhood? So let's find 2 comps that are exactly the same. The only thing that is different between these comps, comp 1 has 3 bedroom and comp 2 has 4. And the appraiser can determine that comp 3 sold for $250, comp 4 for $254.5. So if the only difference is the number of bedrooms, can't we use these 2 comps to determine the cost of a bedroom? The going rate for a bedroom is $4,500. Again, we're back with our appraiser's hat on. We're back with the sales comparison approach. On your exams, they're not going to expect you to find that cost of the bedroom. But it's important that we understand this is one way that the appraiser may find the cost of a bedroom. They may compare comps and the differences in comps. My real estate firm, we had our sales meeting in April. I guess it was just April. Our sales meeting, we had an appraisal company come in, and I got to tell you guys, it was one of the more interesting sales meetings I've ever attended. In all my 23 years career, this was the best explanation I've heard about appraisers, the best session I attended. Totally worth my time to attend. And one thing, the appraisers, they debunked a lot of myths. And one myth they debunked, appraisers don't have a list There's not some kind of secret list out there that tells them bedrooms are $4,500, fireplaces are X amount, garages are X amount. This is how much each square foot costs. There's not a list. It's all dependent, location, 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 first off, and it's all dependent on all those other factors. So they got to come up with their own methods. They got to come up with their own ways to arrive at these values. So what we're going to do, what are we going to see on our test? And give me just a second. I got to get this to where I need some room here. So if we see, when we see this on our test, we're going to be given some information. So we have the subject property is a 3-bed, 2-bath. It has a fireplace. Comp 1 has 3-bed, 1-bath, no fireplace. It recently sold for $118. Comp 2 is a 4-bed, 2-bath. It's got a fireplace. It recently sold for $126. And as mentioned, they're going to have to give you the cost of the things that they want you to adjust. They've got to tell you what a bedroom's going for, a bathroom, and a fireplace. And the question wants to know, what is the probable sales price? Now, I mentioned most of the time we try to find 3 good comps. This one only gives us 2 because, for timing and everything, but usually we're going to see 3. And when you guys are doing the sales comparison approach, I think you should take 2.5 seconds and set yourself up in a way that looks similar to page 469. So we can see nice, neat rows and columns instead of this one big run-on paragraph. Just my suggestion. So we have our subject property. We have comp 1. We have comp 2. And the things that we're going to look at, we're going to look at the bedrooms. We're going to look at the bathrooms. We're going to look at the fireplace. And the first thing we're going to do is just start by studying our subject. Our subject has 3 bedrooms, 2 bathrooms. It has a fireplace. And then we look at these comps. How do these comps relate to the subject? Comp 1 has 3-bedroom, 1-bath, no fireplace, and it recently sold for $118,000. Comp 2 has 4 bedrooms, 2 baths. It has a fireplace, and it recently sold for $126,000. I see the pink on the left better than I see the paragraph on the right. So this is just a suggestion. This allows me to do a nice side-by-side comparison. It might be worth your time on the test. Again, watch your time on your test. These questions would fall under the math category. And what do we do when we see math on a test? Bookmark it and come back to it. So we're always going to save the math for last. Unless you heard somebody said read. Thank you. Thank you. But before you read, bookmark it and come back to it at the end. All right, so math is always last. So now what we're going to do, you and I are going to compare comp 1 as it relates to the subject, and then I'm going to let you guys do comp 2. So let's look at comp 1 first. My subject has 3-bedroom. Comp 1 has 3 bedrooms. What do I need to do? Do I need to make any adjustments? No, we're pretty even, right? So we're good. My subject has 2 bathrooms. Comp 1 has 1 bathroom. What do I need to do to make my right hand match my left? I need to add. Specifically, I need to add the cost of a bathroom, which the problem tells me bathrooms are going to go for $4,000. My subject has a fireplace. My comp does not. What do I need to do to make my comp match my subject, to make my right hand match my left? I need to add. I need to add the cost of a fireplace, which they tell me is $2,000. So this property, comp A, sold for $118,000. We've adjusted the comp to match the subject, which gives us an adjusted value for comp 1 of $124,000. Questions? I'll get yours in a second. I got you. All right, what I want you guys to do now is study Comp 2 as it relates to the subject. Cover up Comp 1. Comp 1 doesn't exist. And you're going to study Comp 2 as it relates to the subject. And then you're going to tell me in a private chat what is the adjusted value for Comp 2. The question is, what is our adjusted value to Comp 2? What is the adjusted value for Comp 2? Once we adjust Comp 2 to match the subject. You guys about 30 more seconds, then we'll talk about Comp 2. All right. So Comp 2 as it relates to the subject. My subject has 3 bedrooms. Comp 2 has 4. What do I need to do to make my comp match my subject? I need to deduct. I need to lower the cost of a bedroom. I need to deduct a bedroom from Comp 2. No, what's a bedroom going for? 4,500. So we deducted, we lowered that cost of a bedroom, so now they match. My subject has 2 bathrooms. Comp 2 has 2 bathrooms. Do I need to do anything? Subject has a fireplace. Comp 2 has a fireplace. Do I need to do anything? No. So we only have one adjustment to make. So we take the 126 that a buyer paid for it, and we make an adjustment. Oops. If a buyer was paying for Comp 2 and Comp 2 only had 3 bedrooms, how much would they pay for Comp 2? They would have paid 121.5. That's the theory behind how do we adjust the comps to match the subject. Because this is a sales comparison approach, the appraiser is going to give it a value. And I'm not an appraiser, I'm not licensed, but if I were to offer my opinion, I see Comp 2 as a better comp than Comp 1 because we had fewer adjustments to make. And I believe that the appraiser, bless you, I believe that the appraiser would put more value on Comp 2 than they would Comp 1. So we're not going to do a simple averaging, we're doing a correlation. And while I can't tell you what the appraiser's opinion of value is, I have a feeling it's going to be closer to the 121.5 because we have fewer adjustments. If this were a CMA, this is really easy. Mr. and Mrs. Seller, I think your probable sales price is going to be between 121,500 and 124,000 based on this, the condition, comparison to the other homes in the neighborhood, et cetera, the market, et cetera. This is what a good listing price would be. This is what I propose for a listing price. Questions on the sales comparison approach? Now I know I see you guys take my end of class exam. I certainly in the state exam, I'm assuming. I certainly don't expect you guys to sit in the state exam and do this full blown. You know, they may kind of watch you. So what I see you guys do in the test is like this abbreviated. You guys are so cute. And I see you sitting there and like, okay, this is my subject and this is my comp. How do I make a match? This is my subject. This is my comp. How do I make a match? So do the abbreviated, right? Don't do this full blown thing for your I got you guys looking at your butts. I got you doing this weird hand trick. What else? Oh, count on your fingers. Guess what? I don't care. I'm trying to get you guys through the test. I don't care how y'all look. We're trying to get you through the test. Fair enough? So do this little modified version if you're worried about how you look, knowing the goal is getting you through the test. And I'm telling you, the hand trick is helpful. I know some of you are sitting right now going, I'm not counting on my fingers, Julie. I'm not doing it. I'm not doing this hand trick. Okay. Just trying to help. Questions on the sales comparison approach? Can I erase? Do we have this? All right. It's break time too. So let's take 10. When we come back, we're going to talk about the appraiser's other approaches. 2 other approaches to talk about. welcome back. Okay, so let me take attendance. We had a question come in that I want to address. The question was, do we see the appraisal before doing our CMA? And the answer is no. If we had an appraisal, we wouldn't need a CMA, right? Because then we have that opinion of value. So usually the way it, typically how it's going to go, we'll do the CMA to get the listing. If the broker and the seller are way off, we may suggest going in together on a CMA. We may talk about getting not a CMA, I'm sorry, an appraiser before we list, right? If it's, remember that property that doesn't conform out in the middle of nowhere, the monstrosity on the hill, it may not be that we can do a CMA because we don't have anything around it that's similar. So it might be we look at that seller and say, to make sure you get maximum value, what do we think about doing an appraisal before we list, right? So it's always an option, but I'm going to say it's going to have to be a, fairly unique property. So we're doing our CMAs to help us arrive at the probable sales price, to help us arrive what to list it for. Flip that coin. Your buyer looks at you, you're shown property. Buyer walks into a home and says, this is it. This is my dream house. Let's write it up. And the very next question out of their mouth is going to be, how much should I offer? And in that case, we need to do a CMA. Don't blurt a number out. Don't just look at your buyer and say, oh, offer asking price, I'm sure they're fine. That's when we need to do our CMAs. Does that make sense? Once the buyer gets under contract, then the lender orders the appraiser. So we're well into the process, which I say all that to say, we need to be competent in doing these CMAs because a lot's riding on this before we get to the appraisal piece. Remember, you guys, the lender determines value on whichever is less, the sales price or the appraised amount. So we need our CMAs to be close. That's how we can protect our clients. That's us doing these in a competent manner. Any questions on the sales comparison approach? One of the appraiser's approach to value, if you don't have it written down yet, sales comparison approach is best for resale and land. What I mean by that, they're going to put the most weight on the sales comparison approach when they're arriving at value for resale properties, when they're arriving at value at land. And that's what we're saying. Questions on the sales comparison approach? Resale and land. Another approach that appraisers may take to help them arrive at value is the cost approach. And I think one thing we're going to realize as we get into studying this cost approach, this is the approach that the appraisers can use practically every time. The cost approach is best for special use properties. We're going to put the most weight on the cost approach when we're trying to arrive at value for special use properties. What are special use properties? Churches, schools, libraries, hospitals. New construction. New construction falls under the cost approach. I don't have enough recently sold churches nearby to study comps. Churches don't sell as often as resale homes. Does that make sense? I don't have enough libraries around that sell on the regular that we can use the sales comparison approach. With the cost approach, it's going to be best for special use properties and new construction. Make sure you jot that down. How the cost approach works, the big picture. We separate the structure from the land. So the appraiser is first going to put value on the land as if it were vacant. Pretend that there's no structure on the land. If you were buying this dirt today, how much would you pay for the land? Maybe they do the sales comparison approach for the land. Maybe they do a cost per square foot for the land. Several different methods for them to arrive at the land. Then they're going to study the structure as if we were building it new. So we're starting with dirt, we're putting value on the land, and then we're going to value the structure as if it were new, if we were building it today. And of course, in a second, we got to take into account depreciation. Because unless this building is new, we got to take into account the fact that it's not. So we'll talk about depreciation in just a second. So we put value on the land, we put value on the structure. We separate the two in the cost approach, or the appraiser does, in the cost approach. The structure is the one that we need to talk about, several different things. So let's talk about putting value on the structure. And as mentioned, they're going to ask themselves, if I were building this today, what would it cost? And there's a couple different costs that they can consider if we were building it today. If we were to rebuild an exact duplicate at today's prices, then the appraiser would put a value on the structure as if we were building it today. They would use the reproduction cost. Reproduction cost is most commonly used for historic buildings. If we were to rebuild an Old Salem, we would have to build in a way that it looked like Old Salem. So we're building an exact duplicate. We may also be building using a replacement cost. It's not an exact duplicate, but it serves the same purpose. If we were using the cost approach for an elementary school, and we were to build an elementary school today, building an elementary school today is different than building an elementary school 40 years ago. 40 years ago, they may not be wired for things like internet, right? So building a school is not an exact duplicate, but it's still an elementary school. So depending on the type of property, which cost they're going to use, we'll depreciate in just a second. The square footage method is looking at that cost per square foot times the total number of square foot. Remember, cost per square foot, that words mean divide. This is a refresher from Unit 4. So if we have the cost, how much does each square foot cost? That's what we're asking with the cost per square foot. This square foot costs $150. This one costs $150. This one costs $150. Each square foot costs $150 times the number of square feet. We could arrive at cost using the cost approach or the square foot method. So let's say, for example, we find out the cost per square foot is, I don't even know my own math up here. Let's say we find out each square foot costs $65, and we know that there are 1,500 square feet. How would we could arrive at this cost? We would determine the cost of this structure is $97, $97,500. Cost per square foot times the number of square feet. So each square foot costs $65. There's 1,500 of them. So using the square foot method, we can say 97,500. Same thing with land too. Cost per square foot or cost per acres. This is the most commonly used method. Just real brief, FYI. There's also a unit in place method and a quantity survey method. Again, we're still trying to get costs for the structure or the land. The unit in place measure looks at the construction cost per unit. So how much does it cost me to build this section? Whatever that unit is you define. That's my labor, my overhead, my profit margins. How much does it cost me to build this section, this unit? The quantity survey method just looks at the raw materials. When they come in off the back of the truck, how much do those raw materials cost me? These are the lesser used of the two because the cost, the square foot method is a more accurate. So that's why this slide is just an FYI. As mentioned, Since we're putting structure, since we're putting a cost on these structures as if they were being built today, the truth is they're not. We're pretending if I were to build this today. But the truth is that church is standing right there and it wasn't being built today. And we got to take into account depreciation. Depreciation is just the loss in value for any reason. Whenever things start losing value, they have depreciated. Through the eyes of the appraiser, depreciation is a big accounting tool. We got an accountant's unit. We'll see about getting to, but it's a big accounting tool. But remember, we're in the appraiser's unit. So depreciation, as far as the appraiser is concerned, the appraiser considers depreciation as any physical deterioration, functional obsolescence, or economic obsolescence. And we're going to talk about each. The things that the appraiser takes into consideration for depreciation, these are the things that could lose or cost a lower value. So first up is physical deterioration, and I got two different types of physical deterioration. There's physical deterioration that is curable. This is just physical wear and tear. It's something that's economically and physically feasible to do. Every once in a while, you got to slap a new coat of paint on a structure. That's curable physical deterioration. It's economically and physically feasible. What I mean by that is you slap a coat of paint, you're going to get your money back when you sell it. It's curable. It makes sense to do it. Compare curable physical deterioration to incurable physical deterioration. Incurable means it may not be economically feasible. I'm not a structural engineer. I feel the need to qualify that. I'm not telling you, I'm not going to stand in front of you and tell you that there's structural issues with this home. If you were my buyer and you were buying this home, I would highly recommend you talk to a structural engineer. Does it look like there's a pretty good chance this home has structural issues? We know we're not structural engineers, but what do y'all think? Is your little red flag going nuts right now? Yeah. Assuming the structural engineer comes in and says, this is going to cost so much money to fix. Whenever you get into structural foundation, you can start tacking on lots of dollar signs. It may not be economically feasible to fix this. That's why it's incurable. So the structural engineer comes in and they say, well, yeah, you could fix this, but it'd be $60,000. Now you got to ask yourself, if I sell this, can I get my $60,000 back? That's what we mean by not economically feasible. So physical deterioration can be curable or incurable. Functional obsolescence can also be curable or incurable. Functional obsolescence is just outdated designs. Blue, well, not just specifically blue. Shag carpet's making a comeback, y'all. Brass fixtures are making a comeback. We're not done with them yet, right? But as styles and trends change, a curable functional obsolescence is to update. It's feasible, economically feasible to change out the carpet. It's economically feasible to change out those fixtures. It's a curable, outdated design. The first apartment I lived in High Point, the kitchen, the appliances, the countertops, the walls, the floor, the entire kitchen was avocado green. Pretty. That is a curable functional obsolescence. I mean, even the dang refrigerator, everything in that kitchen was avocado green. That's an outdated design. Once upon a time ago, that was popular. Don't laugh, it might come back. Incurable functional obsolescence then are outdated designs that it's not economically feasible to fix it. It doesn't make good sense to fix it because you're not going to get a good rate of return. This is a cute little house, isn't it? I found this on MLS. I said, oh my goodness, this house is so cute. It's got, let's see, it was built in 1920. So it's obviously had some facelifts over the years. Looks pretty good, doesn't it? Y'all want to know what's wrong with this house? What I identify this house as an incurable functional obsolescence because of the year that it was built. This thing only has one bedroom. I'm sorry, one bathroom. It's got 4 bedrooms, but it only has one bathroom. In 1920, that's the way we rolled. Today, we all want our own bathrooms, don't we? We need more than one bathroom today. And the cost of coming in, if it's even possible, I mean, you guys can see here, they got a neighbor here. There is another neighbor here. So we don't have any room to go out. If we were to come in and add another bathroom, it's going to have to be in the back of the house or something. You with me? It may not even be doable. But if it is doable, you got to stop and ask yourself, is it worth my rate of return? Adding another bathroom may not be your rate of return. It may not be. It may be incurable, functional, incurable, outdated design. Another good example, not all homes have central AC. Some homes have window units. And before you run in there and add central AC, you need to ask yourself, is this economically feasible? And if you're not going to get your money back, that would be an incurable, outdated design. The last depreciation tool the appraiser has is economic obsolescence. These are always incurable. Economic obsolescence are always incurable. And these are environmental or economic factors that happen outside of the property boundaries. It's stuff that's nearby. If you want to live across the street from a landfill, that would be an economic obsolescence. You may not have the value. What are we looking at in this picture? My Winston-Salem people. You all know where Village Tavern is. Haynes Mall Boulevard, Village Tavern. Yes? That road that runs behind Village Tavern is Griffith Road. And if you get on Griffith Road and you go the whole way out to the end, keep going, keep going, keep going until Griffith Road ends. Griffith Road ends at Clemens Road. And on the intersection of Griffith and Clemens Road is what you're looking at. This is the sewer treatment plant. And there's lots of residential properties around the sewer treatment plant. And I'm telling you right now, when you walk out on your front porch on a hot July day, it does not smell good. That is an economic obsolescence. There's nothing we can do about it. It's an outside force. Landfills, sewer treatment plants, any kind of chemical plant. Canton, North Carolina, up in the mountains, used to be a paper mill town. You think, oh, they're just making paper. How bad can it smell? You remember driven through Canton? I think that paper mill shut down. That is an economic obsolescence. That's an outside force. A couple other things with the cost approach, and we'll look at an example. The appraiser needs to determine how far into the useful life we are. Remember, we act like we're building the structure new, but the truth is we're not. The structure has been here. So now we need to take into things like, what is its economic useful life and how many years into it are we? So the age life method looks at how long do we expect this property to be useful. Let's just say, for example, we say 30 years. We're not saying at the end of 30 years it's going to collapse and fall down. What we're saying is after 30 years, it stops having that kind of value. It's still standing, it's still good, but it doesn't have the values what it did when we first built it 30 or 25 years ago. So the economic life, we're trying to determine how long into this useful life of the building we are, and that'll help us determine how many years of useful life we have left. By the way, you guys, we're still talking about putting costs on the structure. For our purposes, for pre-licensing world, land does not depreciate. It's only the structure that's going to depreciate. Structures come and go. You know what's still there when we tear a structure down? That land. So this is just on the structure that we're talking about. The straight line method. The straight line method, this is the accounting tool that the appraisers use. And with the straight line method, all we're saying is we're going to depreciate the same amount every year over its useful life. So what did I just say? This building has 30 years. Its useful life is 30 years. And straight line depreciation, I'm making numbers up, but let's say we put a value of this building of 1.5 is the cost. And we determine this thing is good for 30 years. It can still have value, generate value for 30 years. So when I take 1.5 divided by 30, I get $50,000. Straight line depreciation says year one, it's going to depreciate by 50,000. Year two, it's going to depreciate by 50,000. Year three, year four, etc. for the next 30 years. How much is it going to lose? How much is it going to depreciate each year? It's going to depreciate $50,000. And that's what the straight line method is. It's easier instead of saying, well, it's more useful at the beginning than it is on year 29. No, 50,000 every year across the board. So we're looking for some kind of formula. These get a little tricky because each of these are different. But we're going to keep this. This isn't the math I want you guys stressing about. But because we may see it, we're going to take that replacement or that reproduction cost. The problem will have to tell us which one to use. It'll give us the replacement or the reproduction cost. And we got to deduct the depreciation. How many years into the useful life are we? How much do we have to deduct for economic obsolescence? Once we deduct depreciation from the cost, then we add our land site improvements. And that's the whole gist of the cost approach. You separate, you've put value on the land different than value on the property. Look with me, if you will, on page 471. And on 471, we've taken our same subject property. We're still on 155 Potter Drive. But now we're going to look at it studying the cost approach. So the first thing we're going to study is the land. This appraiser used the cost per square foot method. They found their lot 60 by 135. They figured out $450 per front foot. So using the square foot method, they determined the cost of the land is $27,000. And then they're going to add $8,000 for improvements, so driveways, sidewalks, etc. So just putting value on the land only, this appraiser, as if it were vacant, this appraiser has determined that the cost of the land is $35,000. Now we need to put a cost on the structure. This is where it gets lengthy, and this is where the work is done, is putting costs on the structure. So we got a building valuation. We're going to look at the replacement cost. Again, the square foot method tells us 1,500 square feet at $65 per square feet. So just to rebuild, using the replacement cost to rebuild this structure today, we'd be looking at $97,500. But the truth is we're not building this structure today. This structure has been here. So now we need to take into account depreciation. We're going to lose some. There's some curable. There's some that needs to have some paint done. There's some structural issues. There's some functional obsolescence. So we got to deduct these things. We got to take into account these things for depreciation. That gives us a building valued at $81,750. So I got land valued at $35,000. I got a structure at $81,750. What is the appraiser going to say this is going for? They're going to add the two together. They're going to give their opinion of value using the cost approach of $116,750. Remember, the key to the cost approach is putting value on the land and putting value on the structure and then adding them back together. So I got a problem, and I know it looks long and complicated. Again, this is not the math that we're stressing out about. However, I do want to give you guys a few minutes if you'd like, if you're feeling up to it. Take just a few minutes, make some notes, jot it around. Look at the formula, the cost minus the depreciation. What have we lost in value so far? And I'll give you guys a few minutes and then we will talk about this together. I'm not even looking for anything in the chat. I just want you guys to take a look at it, see what you think so far. If you're stuck, one thing you may want to do, hold on just a second. You may just want to label land structure, STRUCT, and see which numbers go under land, which numbers go under structure. Start by separating the land from the structure. Just a few more seconds, then we'll talk about it all together. So let's talk this through. Let's see what we got. So I got an estimated building has an estimated replacement cost 550 per square foot. It's got 3,000 square feet. The land's estimated at 400,000 with 120,000 site improvements. Appraisers determined that the building has an effective age of 10 years, a useful life of 40. Using the cost approach, what are we going to determine this value of this building be? I tend to start with the land just because it's a little easier. So with the land we are told that the value of the land is 400,000 and I have site improvements of 120,000. So if I were to take this into consideration, we can determine that if I were selling the land just by itself, pretending that the land is vacant, we could determine that I could sell this land for 520,000. All we did was put a value, or all the appraiser did was put a value on the land. The structure is where it gets a little bit more complicated. So first off, we know we're going to use the replacement cost. If I were to build this house today using the replacement cost, how much would it cost me? Well, it's going to cost me $150 per square feet. How many square feet do I have? I have 3,000 square feet. So if I take 150 times 3,000, if I were to build this property today, it would cost me $450,000 using the replacement cost when I have square feet of $150. If I were to build this today. However, the truth is I'm not building this today. The truth is that it already exists. It has been around. It's 10 years into its useful life. So it has been determined, appraiser's job, it has been determined that the useful life on this thing is 40 years. And what we're telling you is of its 40 years, we're already 10 years in. So that 450,000 reflects if we were building it today. We're not building it today. We need to take into consideration that we're already 10 years in. To figure this depreciation, I first need to figure out how far in I am. 10 years divided by the 40 years, optional, is going to give me 25 or 25%. I have used up a quarter of the useful life. Everybody with me so far? It's useful for 40 years. I've used up a quarter of it. So we got to account for a quarter. We got to depreciate it by 25% because that's where we are today. So if I take that 450 minus 25%, take into account that depreciation. If there were other like physical obsoletes or functional obsoletes, obviously would take that into consideration as well. The problem doesn't give me all that. I can only work with what I got. So I deducted 25% because that's how far into its useful life I am. That's how much I've used up. Now that I have a structure on the land, I'm sorry, a cost on the land and a cost on the structure. Now we just add them up. So using the cost approach to value, we can determine, the appraiser would determine this property is worth $857,500. Keep it simple, you guys. Cost minus depreciation, and then add to it the value of the land, whatever they give you for the land. Questions? Cost approach is best for special use properties. Sales comparison approach is best for resale and land. Cost approach is best for special use. Cost approach is the one approach that the appraisers can use practically every time. They can always answer the question, if we were building this structure today, what would it cost? Where would we be? And that's what the cost approach is looking at. The third approach to value that the appraiser may take. Oh, well, look, there's a picture for us. Sorry. So we got the structure and the land. We separate them. We look at the value of the structure minus any depreciation. We look at the value of the land. And together we get the cost approach. The third approach that the appraiser may take is called the income capitalization approach. And this is good. This is the best approach to use for properties that produce an income. Income producing properties are those that collect rent. Maybe it's a retail, maybe it's an office park, maybe it's an apartment building. The theory behind the income capitalization approach says the amount of rent we collect helps us determine what the property is worth, what its value is. So we got to study what our income is. We got to study what it is we're collecting from this income producing property. If it doesn't produce an income, the appraiser can't use it. So the theory behind it says that what it's worth today is based on how much rent it's collecting. How much rent do I think I can collect? Are rental values going up? That increases the value of the building. Are rental values going down? That decreases the value of the building. The whole theory is based off of how much income. Couple things. We're kind of wearing two hats in this section when we talk about income capitalization approach. We're looking through the eyes of the appraiser, but the income capitalization approach is also helpful to the investor that's considering purchasing this investment property. So there's several things to look at here. One thing the investor cares about is their net operating income and their capitalization rate. The net operating income helps the investor analyze the profitability of their income producing property. It shows the investor, this is how much I have after I've paid my operating expenses. We're going to look at a formula in just a second. The capitalization rate is the investor's rate of return. How much money do I need to make to pay off my debt? To pay for this property? The investor's capitalization rate is going to kind of be subjective. It's going to be the ideal capitalization rate of return is going to be per the investor. For example, just as an example, let's say you're getting into the investment game and you bought your first investment property. All your eggs are in that one basket, right? You have one investment property. What if that tenant doesn't pay this rent? How much? Pay rent this month. Why am I getting my words back? Pay rent this month. How much did you make this month? Zero. Everything you do is riding on this one tenant, right? Now you've added to your portfolio, and now you're an investor with 20 investment properties. Your eggs are diversified, aren't they? You got your eggs in several different places. So remember that tenant that didn't pay rent? You have 19 other properties to get you through that. Does that make sense? So the rate of return, the capitalization rate, is going to be dependent on the investor. I got a formula. I need you guys to write it down. I cannot do the T-bar. This is one of those formulas that you just need to know. And we're going to see this formula again. So what's this tell you about an importance of a formula you're going to see twice? You got a good chance of seeing it on your exams? I'm just saying. Jot this down, and then we're going to talk about it. We actually get to build on it. So just go ahead and jot it down so you have it in front of you. This formula later needs to go on a flashcard. All formulas go on a flashcard. If you don't know the formula, you don't know what to do with the problem. So let's talk about what this formula means. We're going to start with your potential gross income, also referred to as your PGI. I call the PGI the dream. You're collecting rent on time every time. If every single tenant were to pay you rent this month, that's your PGI. Potential gross income is the max you can make on this investment property. By the way, you guys, I need you to read these questions. If the problem tells you it's a duplex, how many units is that? 2, which means you're collecting how many rents? 2. I need you to pay attention to these problems. Okay. So the PGI is the dream. I collect on time every time. This is the max that I can make from this income producing property. The truth is PGI is not real, because the truth is you have vacancy. The truth is you have delinquent tenants. The truth is you got to deal with collection losses. So from the PGI, we deduct our vacancy and collection losses. If I got to take a tenant to court, that would be a collection loss. Vacancy from PGI gives me my effective gross income, also known as my operating income. I'm sorry. Where am I today? Potential gross income is the dream. The effective gross income is the reality. Once I deduct vacancy, I'm not collecting the max. I'm collecting my effective gross income. So potential is the max I could collect. Effective is what I'm actually collecting. Because the truth is, even your best tenant may move out, and you may have a couple weeks of vacancy before you can get a new tenant in, right? So it's a very reality of investors. From the EGI, we deduct our operating expenses. Operating expenses, we're going to see some examples, but they're the things you need to operate. So, utilities, management fees, maintenance, janitorial, all examples of operating expenses. Please make a note. Debt service is not part of operating expenses. Debt service is not part of your operating expenses. So what do you do when you see debt services in this problem? You say, that's my distractor. Don't include it in my operating expenses. Depreciation is not included in operating expenses. So once we deduct our operating expenses from our EGI, then we get our net operating income. If I can offer a trick to help you, let's see. One trick I have to help you memorize this formula. Y'all want to talk about Oreos? If we can remember this saying, I guess is what you would call it. Poor Violet eats Oreos nightly. That tells us the order of the formula. How do I remember the order of the formula? Let's talk about Violet. Poor Violet eats Oreos nightly. If it helps, great. We just got to remember that order. We got to know that formula. So thinking of Violet helps you, great. Now that we've gotten to the net operating income, this is a two-step problem. Step 1 is going to be solved for the NOI. Now that I know the NOI, I can use my T-bar. Net operating income is part of value, looking at the capitalization rate. The problem will give you the value or the cap rate. They're not going to give you the NOI. It's going to give you the information that you need to find the NOI. We find the NOI by thinking of Violet. So 2 steps. Step 1, you got to use the formula to find the net operating income. Once you find that net operating income, we can fill in our T-bar to find value or cap rate. They'll give you one and ask you for one. Turn with me in your book, please, to page 475. We can see our sample income capitalization approach played out. And then we'll take a break. When we come back from break, I got one for you guys. I got one for us to work, of course. But let's look at our sample. So I got my potential gross income. This is 100% capacity. This is the dream. I'm collecting rent on time every time this month. $60,000 is the max I can make from collecting rent. This property has income from other sources. So it's got a vending machine on it. It has something called a payphone on it. Between that income from other sources, we have an additional income of $600. So our potential gross income is $60,600. This property suffers 4% vacancy and collection losses estimated. So we deduct 4% to get our effective gross income of $58,176. Then we got to deduct our operating expenses, taxes, insurance, maintenance, utilities, management fees, decorating expense, why not? All of these operating expenses we deduct from our effective gross income to give us a net operating income of $30,876. The problem tells us the capitalization rate is 10%. We take our net operating income divided by the cap rate. And using the income capitalization approach, the appraiser can determine, based on the rent that we have coming in and the expenses that we have going out, the value of this property is $308,760. If rent changes, that's going to change. Questions so far? All right. Let's take our last break. When we come back, we're going to do a problem together, income capitalization approach, and then we're going to wrap up unit 17. So let's take 10. Okay. I am going to take attendance. I want to make sure you guys have, but Marina, you're in. Make sure you guys have this formula. Everybody have this jotted down. By the way, in case I didn't mention this earlier, this formula is always solved annually. So what are you going to do if they give you monthly rent? Times it by 12. If they give you monthly, I need you to times it by 12 to get annual. Always solved annually. Ready? Let's do private chat for this one. Set your chats to private. Tell me in a private chat, A, B, C, or D. Give you 2 minutes, and then, of course, we'll talk about it. Use your formula. Sorry. Give it one more minute and then we're going to talk about it. All right. What do we do first? Well, we make sure it's a math problem. We've answered everything else, right? Now that it's a math problem, we're doing this one for last. So now that we know we're doing it, first thing we're going to do is just read. Each unit of a fourplex rents for $650 per month. Vacancy losses average 10% per year. Operating expenses are $1,300 per month. This particular investor wishes to realize a cap rate of 8.32%. Based on this information, what would that indicated value using the income capitalization approach be? With these problems, because I know it's a two-step problem, I like to first start with where I'm going to end. And I know I got to end with the T-bar. I say at any time, you know, you can use a T-bar. What does it hurt to go ahead and throw it down and see what information you have? The problem wants me to solve for the value. It gives me the cap rate of 8.32%. The only other piece I'm missing from the T-bar is my net operating income. Do I know my net operating income? Not yet, but I know the information. I have the information I need to find it. And that for right now is my focus, so I can finish my T-bar so I can solve this problem. So we know we have a fourplex, may also be referred to as a quadplex. So I know I have a fourplex. They rent for $650 per month. So my monthly rent from this fourplex is $2,600. But remember what we said, this problem is solved annually. So if I'm collecting $2,600 a month, I need to figure out how much per year. And we can find that my PGI, my potential gross income, is $31,200. First is to find, if I were to collect rent from every tenant on time this year, what's the most I can make on this building? The most I can make is $31,200. Unless I increase rent, everybody with me? This is the dream. The reality is investors suffer vacancy losses. Investors suffer collection losses. If you got to take a tenant to court, you got to take that into your cost of doing business. We're going to talk about taking tenants to court in Unit 11, by the way. So we got to deduct 10%. So maybe you first calculate 10% and then you deduct that amount from the 31,200, or maybe you just deduct 10%. I don't care how you get here. But once we deduct 10%, we're left with an EGI of $28,080. The dream is to make $31,200. The reality this year is I'm going to make $28,080 because we can expect a 10%, that's huge, by the way, but a 10% vacancy loss. Questions so far on how I got my EGI? From there, I need to deduct my operating expenses. The problem gives me monthly operating expenses of 1,300, I need to turn that into annual. So 1,300 times 12 gives me operating expenses 15,600. Minus 15,600 are my operating expenses. Deduct that from my EGI, and I get a net operating income of $12,480. I took my operating expenses times 12 to get annual. Problem gave me monthly. So I had to make it annual by multiplying by 12. Deduct my annual operating expenses from my EGI to get my net operating income. Questions on how I got my NOI? That NOI is the last piece I need to finish my T-bar. That fourth line in the T-bar means divide. So I take 12,480, divide it by 8.32%, and I get a value of 150,000 based on the rent I'm collecting, based on the income. It would be determined that this building, using the income capitalization approach, this building would be worth $150,000. Just solely based off of my income and my expenses. Income capitalization approach. Properties that produce an income. And what I mean by that is properties that collect rent. Questions? My question is always to you. If you didn't get it right, do you see where you went wrong? Perfect. That's how we learn. That's how we learn. Know that formula. Everybody put that thing on a flashcard this afternoon. We're going to see the formula. We're going to expand on the net operating income. So we're going to see the formula for NOI again when we look at our investors math, which is in unit 12. And we're going to take that NOI and we're going to take it a step further. So we'll see this formula again. So solving for NOI, you have the chance to see twice. It's worth knowing that poor Violet eats Oreos nightly. Questions? Good if I erase? Very good. Another thing that investors may look at is called the gross rent multiplier, is what I call it, the GERM. If an investor is purchasing a property, an investor may not know the rent. An investor may not know the operating expenses. An investor looking to buy may not have this information yet. It might be that the owner says, once we're under contract, then I'll release my books. So the question for the investor is it worth contracting? Is it worth going that far? And the tool they may use to answer that question is called the gross rent multiplier. And what the gross rent multiplier does is it answers the question. If I buy this income producing property, how many months or how many years do I make my payment to the bank before I get my money back? If we're looking at monthly rental income, it's going to tell the investor how many months before they get their money back. Annual rental income is telling the investor, and this is all projected. So it might be this investor has their agent doing a CMA for a probable lease price. Based on the CMA, the investor may use the gross rent multiplier in the formula. We're not doing math with this, but the formula Just take the sales price and divide it by the rental income. If you're using monthly rent, your GRM is going to tell you how many months before you get your money back. If you're using annual rent, then it'll tell you how many years. So if I buy this property today, how long before I start seeing that return? How long do I have to make payments on it? And that's what the GRM helps the investor. All right, put your appraiser's hat back on. Wrap this unit up. Put your appraisers back on. So appraisers, we've studied our three approaches of value. We studied the property and we looked at our three approaches of value. The appraiser is going to use as many of the approaches as they can. Whether or not they can use an approach is dependent on what type of property it is. Is it a resale? Is it an income producing property? Practically every property we can use the cost approach. Once the appraiser goes through and does their thing, they use as many of the approaches as they can. The final act for the appraiser is this reconciliation. They have an approach of value based on the sales comparison approach. They have an approach of value based on the cost approach. So how does the appraiser arrive at one price? They do this reconciliation. We do not do simple averaging. They're going to put the weight on the approach based on the type of property that it is. Sales comparison approach, resale and land. Cost approach, special use properties. Income capitalization approach, properties that produce an income. Based on the property, that tells the appraiser which approach to put the most weight on. Their final reconciliation will give them a number. They do not get to use a range. That's only for you and I. So now what I want us to do is pull your reading glasses back out and let's go back in our books, back to our sample appraisal on page 464. And now that we know what we know, let's look at our sample appraisal. So on page 464, again, looking at that black line on the left-hand side, you got the subject property. We defined everything we need to know about the subject property. The contract information, what are the buyer and the seller under contract for? What's the neighborhood information, the surrounding area? The site information, that's the land, the lot. And then any improvements to the site. So there's our foundation, for example. How many units is it? What are the appliances on it, etc. Then over on 465, we see in action the sales comparison approach. So this appraiser used the sales comparison approach. They had the subject property of 123 Colorado Lane. They found 3 good comps. They went through and studied the comps as they relate to the subject. And they arrived at their value using the sales comparison approach. Near the bottom, on the sales comparison approach of $265,000. The last little section there is the reconciliation. But before we look at that, let's flip over to page 466. $466 are any additional comments, notes that the appraiser has. Then we have the cost approach. So the appraiser used the cost approach for this property as well. Under that is the income capitalization approach. You see how that's blank? That's because this property didn't produce an income. They have no numbers to use there. So this appraiser could only use sales comparison approach and cost approach. They're going to use as many as they can. And then the last little section there is PUD. So like if it's in an HOA, what kind of community? You know, the idea of a PUD is you can live, work, and play all right here. So what are the amenities? What are the features nearby, etc.? That's that PUD. All right, so let's go back to 465. And at the bottom of 465 is our reconciliation. And we can see the reconciliation. We got indicated by the sales comparison approach of 265, cost approach of 265, 516. The last line on page 465 is the appraiser's final opinion. After studying this property in the sales comparison approach, after studying this property in the cost approach, it looks to me like the appraiser put the most weight on the sales comparison approach. Everybody see that? They used what they got to for the sales comparison approach. It tells me this is a resale property. That last line there, 265 as of 8/25/2016. The appraisal is for a specific property as of a specific date. That $265,000 at the bottom of page 465 is the number that the lender cares about. That is the number that they were looking for. And based off of the contract price, remember, the lender defines value as the sales price or the appraised amount, whichever is less. In this case, if we look here, we saw on page 464 that the sales price was $263,900. We just saw that it appraised for $265. It appraised for more than the sales price. This buyer will get loan approval, the loan to value ratio on the sales price, because value is defined as whichever one is less. Questions on our appraisal? I want to point something out real quick. Go back to page 477. And you will note under the note on 477 that they talk about something called automated valuation methods, or AVM. These are like computer generated methods for determining value. You guys know AVMs better as Zestimates. Have y'all ever heard of a Zestimate? It's Zillow's automated value. The computer is arriving at the value. So what are AVMs? Well, like we just said, they're computer generated, and short and sweet of how these things work. The AVM studies a property. Let's say this dot in the center is a subject property. And then they do a radius search. Depends on density, depends on population. But let's say this AVM uses a half a mile radius. From the subject property, from the dot in the middle, they're going to look at everything that closed within the last 2 months or 6 months, whatever they enter in. And that's all they look at. What closed within this radius within the last 6 months? I don't care if it was commercial or industrial or residential. I don't care if it was a condo or a townhome or a single family. They don't look at any of the features. All the computer generated look at is what closed within this radius within this amount of time. And that is our AVM. Now knowing what you guys know, do you think AVMs are reliable? You think there's something that we can rely on and trust? Not even a little bit, because we know there's a lot more involved than what closed within this half mile radius within the last 6 months. See, computers aren't taking our jobs yet. You still need the human touch on CMAs and sales comparison approaches. What questions do I have? Anybody ready to sign up for appraisal school? Anybody ever thought about it? No, it's okay. You don't have to. Some of you are like, no, it's okay. It's okay. I've recently joked this might be my next my next real estate venture. I don't know. I find this very interesting, and I keep hearing that appraisers are aging out, and there might be a need for them one day soon. And I'm like, maybe one day. You know that how that goes, right? Don't tell Lane. I'm not going anywhere anytime soon, but it's something to think about. All right, let's bring this unit home. Like I said, we're bookending this class. So appraiser hat off, real estate hat back on, broker hat back on. Again, what we do are BPOs and CMAs. What we need to know from this slide, I got license law and commission rule that regulates how we do BPOs and CMAs. Sometimes we have law or rule. These are one of those things that we got law and rule. So 93A-6 is your disciplinary action by the Real Estate Commission, things that we can get in trouble for. That's the license law. There's going to be a subcategory in there that says if we don't do these things competently, we could face disciplinary action. And then Commission Rule 58A.2200 is all about BPOs and CMAs. We're going to get a little deeper in post-licensing. And like we said, you guys are going to get plenty of practice and experience with these once you get out in the real world. So what do we know about BPOs and CMAs? Well, they got to be in writing. How else do we document it if it's not in writing? How else do we share it with buyers and sellers if it's not in writing? So these things got to be in writing. I'm not saying the word value. I don't get to say the word value. I'm not determining these to originate a loan. I'm not determining these to offer my opinion of value. I'm determining these to help my buyers and sellers understand probable sales price. I'm doing these to help my landlords and tenants determine probable lease price. You guys can remind me, you can show me how many years are we required to keep everything? We're documenting everything, but we got to keep it for how many years? 3. BPOs and CMAs fall under that category. Document it all. Keep it for 3 years. We've already seen this, so you may not need to write it down again. PBs, you guys can't do these things for a fee. You can do a BPO or CMA. This is important that you hear what I'm saying. You can do a BPO. You cannot do one for a fee as a provisional broker. Only full brokers and VICs can collect a fee. And then none of us, I don't care who you are, none of us can charge a fee when it's just part of my general broker services, when it's just part of my job. So to perform a BPO or CMA, again, we got license law and commission rule that regulate these. So we can imagine, I just kind of said, these things are heavily regulated. So the process, to give us an idea, to do these, you got to be a qualified broker. What's a qualified broker? One with an active current license. You got to have an active current license on good standing. You're going to identify the scope of the work. Are you doing a BPO or CMA? Who are you doing it for? Is it a residential property? Is it a commercial property? Are you doing it for a client? Are you doing it for a interested third party? Then you got to gather the data, start an MLS. It all starts in MLS. I think we've mentioned MLS has everything that's ever been entered since they started in like the mid-90s. So when you're researching a property in MLS, you can literally go back as far back as they go. And we can see pictures, and pictures can help us see the progress over the years, or lack thereof, if you will. So we're in MLS, we're gathering property on the subject, or data on the subject property. What we're generally doing is a CMA. If you are going into commercial, you're probably going to need a better understanding on the income capitalization approach. So you can help arrive at value using that. And then we report probable sales price or probable lease price, and report it in a range. Do not say value. Do not give an exact number. Be very, very careful. Words matter, you guys. And if you look at a seller and you say, I think your home is worth X amount, you think the seller's going to hold you to that? You better believe it. Protect yourself. Careful what you say, and make sure you report in a range. Questions? The last little thing I have here, it's like my favorite comic strip in real estate. I think it's funny because it's true. But this just really shows value is in the eye of the beholder. Check out the tax assessor. What do they see when they look at your house? Cha-ching, cha-ching, cha-ching. Value truly is in the eye of the beholder. And brokers, it's helpful to remember the seller sees this as their home. Tell you right now, you go in there and you start insulting their home, you think you're getting that listing? And be respectful of who you're talking to. Be mindful of who you're talking to. And that'll help you have these conversations. And remember what I said too, if we're properly doing these CMAs, I don't know much about life, but one thing I do know is that numbers don't lie. And if you're doing these things properly and competently, and you can hand the seller a piece of paper, what you're showing them is, this is what I think a buyer would be willing to pay for your property. Questions, comments? This is through 17. Key terms, again, I need you to think like an appraiser. Put your appraiser hat on for unit 17, unless we're talking about CMAs or BPOs. We have our appraiser's hat on. So those key terms, that basic understanding of what the word means. The key point review is on page 480. Your student quiz is on page 482. There's some practice math at the end of the unit in the student quiz. Also at the end of unit 17, there's the math concepts, another explanation of the maths that we went over. And then there's those 50 problems in the back of your book. These are the numbers that relate to the math that we just did, unit 17 math. But wait, there's more. If we go out and look in the online learning system, and we look at the unit 17 material, there is some additional practice in there, but what I really want to show you guys in unit 17 is a sales comparison approach worksheet. I recommend doing this on your paper, setting it up, you know, your subject property and all your comps, similar to what we looked at in the book, similar to what we worked at in class. What you have with this problem, you have a subject property and everything you need to know about the subject property. And then you have seven comps. I didn't say they were good comps, did I? I just said you had 7 comps. Some of these comps might be better than others. So what you guys are asked to do is using the above information, then you see you have the value of everything. There's what a deck goes for, square foot, etc. Using the above information, you're asked to find 3 good comps to help this seller determine probable sales price. Just because the house next door recently sold doesn't mean it's a good comp. The fewer adjustments you have to make, the better. So while it may appear to be a good comp, once you get in there and start working at it and adjusting the heck out of it, you may change your mind and realize that's not a good comp. And that's kind of the gist of what we're doing. You beep, boop, boop, and put something in MLS and you get all sorts of stuff. And now we got to hone in on what's the good information. What's the information that can help us to get to the numbers? And that's what we're searching. That's what I'm looking for here. I do have my solutions. I'm not saying I'm right. This is my opinion. Could you have a different set of comps? Could you have a different solutions? And that's where these get like really tricky. Remember that competitive listing appointment you're going on? You and I are competing for a listing. My CMA may look different than your CMA, but both of us are having these conversations with the sellers. And I think the one that can prove their work, I think the one that can show where they got their CMA is going to look like the one that knows what they're talking about, as opposed to, here's this report I generated from MLS. I didn't put anything into it, but I think this is what your house can sell for. Versus, I studied everything in your neighborhood. I looked around and this is what I arrived at. So some good practice in here. Questions? Up next on the schedule is Unit 13. I just made an executive decision. We're going to skip 13 for now. I'm not saying I won't cover Unit 13, but I think you can expect to see a test question from 13. We're going to see more from 11. So we're going to go ahead and skip 13 for now. I promise I'll get to it, but I'm ready to get, I'm just ready to get into the good stuff, right? So we're going to jump right into Unit 11. We got about 15 minutes wherever we stop today. And Unit 11 is where we'll pick up on Thursday. Unit 11 is going to have more test questions than 13. And Unit 11 is the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. In Unit 11 is just between the landlord and the tenant. Maybe we've hired a property manager. Maybe we have not. Maybe there's an agent involved. Maybe there's not. 11 is just the relationship between the landlord and the tenant. On Thursday, after 11, we'll jump into Unit 12. And Unit 12 is the property manager. Unit 12 is the piece that brings in the broker. So whether you have a license or not, Unit 11, we're going to talk about leasehold estates. We're going to talk about some basic characteristics of a lease. What are the things that we can expect to see in a lease, those common elements? We have more than one type of lease. So we're going to talk about the different types of leases and their purposes. And then we're going to talk about something called the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act that defines the relationship in North Carolina between the tenant and the landlord. Great candidate for a state-specific test question, talking specifically about the North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. So the first thing we need to do, I am starting on page 322. And the first thing we need to do is define some words. The lease is the bilateral contract between landlord and tenant. It's the agreement that sets forth how long are we going to be in this lease, how much money, what is rent. Security deposit, we're going to talk about security deposit in this unit. The lease spells out all the terms. The lessor is the giver of the lease, also known as the landlord. The lessee is the receivee of the lease, also known as the tenant. So there's our ORs and EEs again. Remember back in Unit 2, we introduced you to an estate. We introduced you to a couple different types of estates. And we spent some time in Unit 2 talking about a freehold estate. Well, there's another type of estate that we didn't get to yet. That other type of estate is where we are right now. And that other type of estate is a leasehold estate. Remember, for your exams, when you see the word estate, what we're saying is what is an individual's interest. An estate is somebody's interest in the property. So what I'm telling you is we have two types of estates. A freehold estate from Unit 2 is our estate of ownership. A leasehold estate, which is where we are right now, is an estate of possession. What is your interest in this property? You either own it or you rent it. That's your interest. And what makes landlord-tenant relationships interesting? These properties are dealing with both types of estates. The landlord has a freehold interest. The tenant has a leasehold interest. We got two interests going on, don't we? Somebody owns it and somebody rents it. So we got both types of interest. Now we're going to talk about those different types of leasehold estates. Before I do that, let me go off book just for 1 second, real quick. Privity of estate and privity of contract. Basically what this is saying, the privity of estate, is I got that dual relationship going on. I got a freehold estate and I got a leasehold estate. Privity of contract says that our leases are only binding on the parties. So if the landlord or tenant pass away, the lease probably dies with them, unless there's something in there that says otherwise. These contracts, these leases, are only binding on the parties. It's going to be really rare. What if the tenant, what if they don't die? What if they skip out in the middle of the night? Can the landlord go after their family? Can they go after their parents to collect rent because the tenant moved out in the middle of the night? I mean, they can try, but how far are they going to get? And that's what we're saying with that privity of contract. So we're going to talk about the different types of estates. You got a nice little handy dandy chart on the top of page 323 that tells us the type of estate and gives us our distinguishing characteristics. So it sums it up for you quite nicely. As we get into these types of estates, the big difference between them, what sets aside one type of estate from another, is how they end. This is our big difference. This is our big defining characteristics of these four types of estates, is how they end. So the first type of estate is called an estate for years, can also be referred to as a tenancy for years. And with an estate for years, we have a specific beginning date, we have a specific ending date. And when it's over, it's over. Nobody needs to do anything. Nobody needs to notify anybody, because we knew this thing was going to end on this date when we entered into this lease. An automatic termination means when it's over, it's over. Can we agree to renew this? Sure. Do we have to? No, we've all agreed this relationship is going to go until this date. Do not let the name of this fool you. An estate for years has nothing to do with the length of time. Maybe it's for years, maybe it's for a year, maybe it's for months, maybe it's for a day. If you're going to rent my house for a day, don't you want a lease? What makes an estate for years an estate for years is because we have a specific beginning date and a specific ending date. The length of time doesn't matter. Another leasehold estate we have is a periodic tenancy, also known as a tenancy from period to period. We have a specific start date, but we don't have an ending date. We're going to automatically renew this until one of us ends it. We keep going until the landlord or the tenant end it, automatically renew. It's not uncommon for an estate for years to turn into a periodic tenancy. You're going to rent my house for a year. We're going to enter into a year lease, estate for years. At the end of that year, you may decide you like living here. I'm providing a roof over your head. I may decide I like you living here because you're sending me rent every month. We could go, when our estate for years is over, we could switch gears and go to a periodic tenancy, maybe a 30-day lease. Have you guys heard of those 30-day leases? You're going to rent for me for 30 days at a time. That would be a periodic tenancy because we don't know when it's going to end. One of us has to end it. Look with me in your book, page 323. With a periodic tenancy in North Carolina, it tells us how much notice we have to give each other. So if our lease started from a week-to-week basis, we need to give each other 2 days notice to end it. Month to month, we need to give each other 7 days. If it's a year to year, we need to give each other 30 days. Somebody's got to end it by giving notice. Another leasehold estate is an estate at will, also known as a tenancy at will. With an estate at will, I don't have an official lease. With an estate at will, the tenant is there because they have permission of the landlord. With an estate at will, one of us has to end it. Generally, it's going to be the landlord that ends it. With estate at will, we don't have to give prior notice. You're there until I tell you got to go. And I don't have to give you prior notice. What's the difference in this one and a periodic tenancy? With a periodic tenancy, we got to give each other notice. With this one, when it's over, I say get out as a landlord. I think the example in your book talks about, is it this one? Yeah, it's talking about how they're going to come and demolish the building. So the landlord says, you can live there until basically the wrecking ball shows up, right? You have permission to be there. No prior notice is required. And the last type of estate is an estate at sufferance. With this type of estate, somebody is suffering. Who's suffering? The landlord. You got yourself a squatter. You got yourself a holdover. It probably was that we started with an estate for years or even a periodic tenancy. And now the tenant won't go. I want you guys to write something down for me. Everybody ready? If you pay, you stay. If you stay, you pay. This situation is the tenant that's there and not paying. If the tenant's paying and the landlord's accepting, we have a periodic tenancy or an estate at wills. With this situation, the tenant is a squatter. They're there for free. If you stay, you pay. If you pay, you stay. Did y'all write that down for me? It's going to answer questions on Thursday. I'm gonna end here, but hang on. On Thursday, we're gonna pick back up. We're on page 325. So I ask that you look ahead at the rest of 320, at the rest of unit 11. When we're done with that, we jump into unit 12. So please look ahead. After 12 is 19. We're going to talk about how, as a landlord, you can get the squatter off your property. We're going to talk about the landlord's rights. We're going to talk about the tenant's rights. That falls under our North Carolina Residential Rental Agreement Act. So the Residential Rental Agreement Act dictates how landlords and tenants proceed. So we'll get into that on Thursday. What else? Last piece of math. We'll probably get to it on Thursday. It's at the end of unit 12, which you're not going to find in your book for some reason. So investors math is the last little piece, and then that's the last math. We're done. Only one more math left, you guys. Yay. What questions do I have? That's what I got. I'm around tomorrow. I'm around this afternoon. Let me know how I can help. Otherwise, you have a good afternoon. We'll see you guys Thursday morning. Jumping right back into unit 11. Thank you.